Office of the President of the United States, 1951. Mr. President, the world finds itself in the crossroads of history, and you, sir, are in the driver's seat. Assembled in the Oval Office were President Truman, select members of his cabinet, and a handful of trusted advisors. Previously, some aide had hung a large map on a free wall, the same place Roosevelt had once been shown similar maps displaying the positions of the American and Allied forces during the Second World War just 6 years prior. Now the map showed the Middle East, with the all-too-familiar iron crosses of the Third Reich dotting territories formerly held by the European colonial powers as far south as Transjordan and Palestine. Each cross represented an entire division of soldiers. By Truman's quick count of the crosses, the Nazis had amassed over 100,000 in the occupied territories. Mr. President, are you listening? The speaker who interrupted his train of thought once more was his Secretary of Defense, John C. Marshall. The man had aged visibly in the post-war years, the strain of European defeat evident on the lines and creases of his face. It weighed him down considerably, and more than once Truman had considered ordering the soldier into an early retirement for his and the nation's own good. Lay the options on the table once more. I want everyone clear on our paths forward. Marshall nodded at the president's command and turned to the map. Seated next to him on one of the couches, hastily pulled into the office for this secret meeting, was the Chief of Staff of the Army, a heavy-set man who, even in his senior years, was still more muscle than fat. He wore a dour look on his face, clearly displeased with the direction of the conversation. Marshall cleared his throat before gesturing at the map. Mr. President, the Third Reich's greatest weakness for the moment is its access to oil deposits. The North Caucasus oil fields are at maximum production, and they are enough to feed the Reich's demands for now. There are exploratory wells being dug in the Volgograd and Saratov, but pre-war Soviet estimates indicated only a few million tons of oil in the region. The Nazis have been far less successful establishing operational fields in Tatarstan and further toward West Siberia. Soviet insurgents have made life hell for them, and their colonization of the former Soviet Union has yet to reach further than 100 miles east of Moscow. Understandably, there's not many German citizens willing to move that far into very hostile territory, and I'm not just talking about the weather. There's also the matter of depopulation efforts by the Reich. At this, every man in the room visibly grimaced. Despite the numerous differences among the military leaders and politicians present, all were disgusted by the reports coming out of what the Nazis had publicly called its Cultural Protection Program. They were slave camps, and some worse. If President Truman hadn't seen the reports himself, he never would have believed the staggering scale of the killing, tens of millions since the end of the war. It appears that Herr Hitler had not considered the effect depopulation of the occupied territories would have on the economy. There are reports he's begun to listen to some of his advisors, and the depopulation has shifted considerably from extermination to forced labor. But the Reich is still in a lurch. Its army captured a whole lot of territory that its security forces then swiftly vacated of most people living there. They're not just lacking in manpower, but skilled labor to dig wells, extract the oil, and so on. The head of the CIA cleared his throat to interrupt. Mr. President, with your permission, I believe there's ways we could significantly disrupt Nazi efforts in the occupied Soviet territories and beyond. Truman's chief spy smiled a cold, empty smile that sent shivers down the spines of most of the men in the room. The Soviets in their Far East territories haven't given up the fight, even without our help. Old Stalin is still sending hundreds of guerrillas west every month. I believe we can greatly accelerate the effort with proper financing. The Kuomintang Chinese army still has large stocks of former Soviet equipment that we could purchase and send over through the Chinese-Soviet border to avoid suspicion from the Nazis. Truman nodded his approval. The Soviet front had been the last of the war, despite constant warnings. Joseph Stalin had never dreamt that Hitler would truly turn on him after conquering Britain and cementing his grip on Europe. The fool hadn't realized that he'd chummed the waters himself with his botched invasion of Finland, proving the Soviet army was incompetent and poorly led. He had to give it to the Soviets, though. They fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground they inevitably lost, causing millions of casualties for the Germans. It had been enough for the US to kick Germany out of North Africa, but an invasion across the Mediterranean to liberate Europe would have still been impossible. Now the Soviets were holed up on the other side of the Urals, a vast frozen wilderness of mostly nothing. Even with US aid, millions of Soviet refugees had simply starved to death. If the Germans didn't eventually cross the mountains to finish them off, the Soviet Union would likely fall apart soon from a simple lack of Soviets. But they still had enough manpower to send constant guerrilla raids across the mountains to harass the Germans. Stalin was a vengeful, bitter bastard. Let's do it. but make sure not a single gun, grenade, even bullet sent is American. We can't afford the confrontation, especially if Truman nodded at Marshall to continue once more. Yes, Mr. President, so as I was saying, the Reich's oil problems are forcing them south. They've seized many of the northern Middle Eastern territories administered by the former European powers, but the region is still relatively oil poor. The true prize is south. Marshall motioned at the southern part of the Middle Eastern map, specifically Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia holds much of the most easily accessible oil fields in the region, perhaps even the planet. Some of these fields are administered by American companies, though the Saudis took over production of most of the fields after the collapse of Britain and France. The nation is rich, Mr. President, but militarily weak. Even with years of military aid, the Nazis could take the nation in a week or two at the most, given the current state of their armed forces. The Chief of Staff of the Army spoke up. Mr. President, we cannot allow the Nazis to take those oil fields. If Saudi falls, so will Iran and the rest of the Middle East. Then we're left with the Nazis holding the tap on the greatest supply of oil on the entire planet. We must prevent this at any cost, Mr. President. Truman knew the cost that the senior Army officer was referring to. The man had been a proponent of using nuclear weapons preemptively since the Middle East crisis began with German troop movements a week ago. The Secretary of the Navy shook his head. The last thing we want is a third world war, especially so soon after the second. The Army chief turned red in the face. We got 24 battle force carriers on the Nazis' 8. Even with them finishing a new one every 16 months, they can't cross the Atlantic. And they damn well know it. We don't need to take Europe. We just need to throw them out of the Middle East. And we need to do it now, while we've still got the nuclear advantage. Truman didn't interrupt the brewing argument just yet. He wanted to hear what the secretary would say. He knew the U.S. retained the nuclear advantage. The Nazis had been slow on developing the bomb during the war. Hitler breaking up research efforts across multiple laboratories in his paranoia didn't help. When the U.S. dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it had been a wake-up call to the Reich, and the German nuclear program had progressed at breakneck speed. They conducted their first test in 1948, but the U.S. had hundreds of bombs by now, and making 100 more a year. His intelligence chiefs told him that the Germans still only had about 100 or so themselves. They may have fewer bombs, but they got far better rockets than we do. And it would only take a dozen nuclear-tipped rockets to bring this country to its knees. New York, Washington, Chicago, Boston, hell, maybe even as far south as Atlanta or Miami. The rockets get better every year. The Navy Secretary was right. The Nazi rocket program under the direction of Werner von Braun had left the U.S. hopelessly behind. They'd even put up a satellite the year prior. It wouldn't take much to put a bomb up there and drop it right on their heads. With our carriers, we could punch open holes in South Europe through the Mediterranean for our bombers. Hell, you should know that. They're your ships. Gentlemen, enough. Truman finally asserted his authority. Taking a moment to allow everyone to compose themselves, he continued. I have no wish to be the president who saw one world war through to its end only to immediately launch a third. Nor do I wish to preside over a nation with a dozen or more American cities suffering the same fate as Nagasaki or Hiroshima. But I agree we must take action in the Middle East. General, would you please continue with our options? Truman nodded at Marshall. He looked positively exhausted as he laid out America's options for averting a Nazi global takeover without launching a destructive nuclear war. We have the conventional option. Even as we speak, on your orders, we've got the Vincent and other ships steaming for the region with enough nuclear munitions for a localized campaign. However, the alternative, and the one I and the Secretary both agree with, I as well, Mr. President. The CIA chief nodded in agreement. The alternative most of us are in agreement with is a simple show of force. Show the Nazis we mean business, drop a nuke close enough to their forwardmost forces in Palestine that it singes their eyebrows. Let them know that we can and we will use nuclear weapons if they encroach on Saudi territory. Truman nodded. As far as the end of the world ideas went, this one seemed the sanest. And the Saudis? Can't help but think they wouldn't be too happy about a nuke going off on their soil. I believe they are in agreement. It's a price well worth paying. The room went quiet as Truman thought to himself. After a few moments, the Army chief broke the silence. Mr. President, I don't believe a show of force is sufficient. We have the advantage, for now. Future generations of Americans will look back on this moment, which may well decide if they live free or in bondage to the Reich. Those future Americans have to actually be born to be able to look back on today. I agree, General. Let's drop the nuke. Show them we mean business. How fast can we get a bomber out there? Marshall nodded, relief on his face for the first time this entire meeting. We can have a B-36 in the air within hours from our airbase in Morocco. They can use one of the pre-staged munitions we have on site. and drop their payload 16 hours from now, just as dusk is falling in the region. Perfect. The psychological effect will be greatly magnified in the dark. The CIA chief grinned again, sending another cold chill down the spines of everyone in the room. Make it so then. This meeting is adjourned. Gentlemen, thank you, and God help us that we made the right choice. 18 hours later, 42,000 feet above Tabuk Province, Saudi Arabia. Joe, we got a problem. Captain Joe Mencino had been expecting the call. The sky was as clear as one could ask for, but several thousand feet below, the desert had turned into a rolling, dark mess. Even at 42,000 feet, the big bomber still shuddered from the massive updrafts. Copy that, Matt. Go ahead. Early in the last war, Joe had done away with standard military protocol aboard his aircraft. Everyone who flew with him knew that as soon as the wheels were up, the standard protocol stopped being as important. They were on their own as far as Joe was concerned, and military protocol had a nasty habit of eating up precious life-saving seconds in situations where that sort of thing mattered. Halfway down the massive length of the big nuclear express B-36 Peacemaker, Mac, his bombardier since the second half of the European campaign, was trying in vain to spot the ground below through his bomber sight. So far, the aircraft had remained on course thanks to radio beacons some Army commandos had raced out in motorbikes to lay out, but the final approach was all up to the navigator and the bombardier. I can't see a damn thing. Locals call it a hubub or something like that, big sandstorm. But we got bigger problems than me not seeing anything. Joe and his co-pilot looked at each other worriedly. Both knew the gravity of the mission and had been fully briefed on the consequences of failure. Joe, we're taking real nasty winds down there, big updrafts. Even if they don't collapse the bomb chute on the way down, there is no telling how far off course they'll blow the damn thing. We're meant to give them Nazi boys a nice tan, not kill thousands of them. As if to punctuate the bombardier's words, the plane shuddered from another massive updraft. Joe moved the mic to a more comfortable position on his face before responding. Yeah, if the chute fails, how long do we have? Estimate. The bombardier was silent a moment. Joe, that's not… Estimate, please. I don't know, 30 seconds? The chutes on the big bomb were supposed to buy around 120 seconds for the bomber to wheel away and haul out of town before the blast. Despite her size, the B-36 was speedy. They might be able to do it in 90. Hell, they might even survive at 60. Joe, I'm telling you, the real problem is I can't even see where to drop or guess where it'll land. It was crucial that they drop the bomb close enough to the nearest Nazi positions that they see and even feel the full effect of the nuclear blast. Otherwise, the show of force simply wouldn't have the teeth it needed to hopefully deter an even more catastrophic conflict. On the other hand, they weren't meant to actually start the Third World War either. We need to abort. His co-pilot instinctively reached for the flight controls, but Joe reasserted his control. Negative. You know damn well what's on the line here. I didn't see one war through just to fight a second. If we get this wrong, it won't matter either way now, will it? Joe wasn't going to argue with his co-pilot. He keyed his mic into the command circuit available to only select members of the crew. Mac, I'm gonna need you to do your very best to put us right on track. We're dropping one way or the other. There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the radio. Sir, I can't even guess wind speeds down there. I don't want to be the guy that started World War III on a guess. Well, then you better make it a damn good guess. Okay. There was silence once more. His co-pilot wore an intense look of disapproval, but despite the relaxed protocols aboard the aircraft, he knew better than to question his captain. The only sound was the steady, dull roar of the 6 engines cutting through the desert winds. Finally, the command circuit crackled to life once more. Captain, make course 343. Hold her steady. Mac had reverted to military protocol. Last time he'd done that, a fighter had just killed half the crew in a single machine gun pass somewhere over southern Germany. Confirmed, you have release authority. The B-36 flew northwest for several more minutes. Finally, the big bomb bay shuttered open, and a single bomb dropped from the belly of the plane. Immediately, the big bomber banked hard to the right, taking advantage of prevailing winds to push it along. The parachute held, initially. Somewhere around the time the bomb penetrated the uppermost layers of a massive dust storm, it must have collapsed. 52 seconds after release, the big bomb exploded 2,000 feet above sea level, the massive shockwave catching up to the big bomber and shaking it until the crew thought that every bolt in the aircraft would come apart. But they didn't, and the B-36 shuddered her way back on course south for her friendly airfields. In its wake, the nuclear explosion was largely shrouded in the massive dust storm, but this had an unexpected effect, as the nuclear fire lit up the massive storm from within, creating an apocalyptic light show even more terrifying than President Truman could have hoped for. West Ural's Cultural Correction Camp No. 118, Reich-occupied territories. Twin smokestacks reached 24 meters into the sky. When they were in operation, the dense black clouds of sooty ash they spilled out contrasted with the stark white peaks of the Ural Mountains behind them. But those smokestacks weren't working now, and hadn't been for a while. Stefan pushed the thoughts of the smokestacks out of his mind. Today was a day of joy for Camp 118. The Nazis largely left the prisoners to their own devices, all of them a mixture of former Soviet citizens and other undesirables of one sort or another the Reich had no need of. There were homosexuals from within the Reich itself, Roma, communists, and even a small number of Jews in the camp. The latter were scarcer and scarcer. They had borne the brunt of the Nazis' extermination efforts during and immediately after the war, when Germany and America signed an armistice agreement after the fall of Europe. They had built a community of sorts for themselves within the razor wire confines of the camp, and as long as they showed up to roll call each evening and performed their assigned work assignments, the guards didn't bother them. Stefan had assumed the role of spiritual leader. Despite the mix of different faiths and cultures, he'd been nothing more than a common Christian man before being rounded up in the German victory over the Soviet Union. He wasn't a priest, nor had any special religious education, but he took to the job anyways, and he did his best to bring a little cheer to his adopted flock. Today was a day of cheer. Toba and his wife Polly, 2 Roman prisoners recently brought to the camp, had a son. The small baby was proof of miracles in Stefan's eyes. Poor, frail Polly had been forced to deliver with no medical attention or supplies, save what could be scrounged up from around the camp. The Nazis didn't actively discourage pregnancies. In fact, they found it best to meddle as little as possible with the prisoners. But the baby's food would come from the same unchanging food rations the Nazis brought in each week. Sadly, with so many dying from the atrocious labor conditions and the extreme weather, there was often at least a little surplus. Stefan knew nothing of Roma culture or what religious rituals they might prefer. His own tradition dictated the baby should be baptized, but he thought that was a choice best left to the parents. Instead, he celebrated with the mother and father, sharing their joy and stoking it like a small fire in a very long, very dark night. "God has brought us a miracle today," Toba smiled at him, proud father, as Polly swaddled the baby in discarded fabric to protect it from the bitter cold. "You think you would have learned, you fool." Stefan knew the source of the slightly slurred words, even before turning around to greet the one who spoke them. Nikita had been a soldier in the Red Army, a full-blooded communist through and through. He was, as he often was, drunk on cheap camp liquor. Some of the men brewed in not-so-secret batches. In exchange for a few bottles for the guards to share, they turned a blind eye to this as well. "You think you would have learned under the communists, but here you still are. Even before the Germans, didn't you learn anything from the purges?" Nikita was referring to the silent campaign the Soviet Union had waged against the Christians, Jews, and Muslims, whose places of worship had often been forcibly converted into museums of atheism under Stalin's reign. The worshippers were either shot or deported, often forced to labor camps not unlike this one. "Where was your God then? Where's your God now, you stupid fool?" Nikita spit out the insult, literally and figuratively. He is in the same place he was when his son hung on the cross, weeping at the evil of man and the price required to redeem him. Nikita blinked a few times in surprise. Clearly, this was not what he had been expecting. "So, you admit your God didn't even care to save his own son?" "Nikita, you can have perfect morality or free will, but not both." The old communist grew angry. How dare this religious idiot twist communist ideology about free will and self-determination around on him? "If your God is so good, then where is he now? Where was he in the war?" Stefan shook his head slightly, then turned to look at the newborn baby. "He is here, Nikita." He turned once more to the communist, placing a hand over his heart. "Always here." Nikita grew enraged, but whether it was the cheap booze or his anger at the religious fool's refusal to insult him back, he choked on a response. A loud whistle pierced the chilly air. The sun was starting to set, and daily counts never took place before full dark. In the distance, there was the sound of approaching trucks and the shouting of guards. A cold chill ran down the spine of everyone gathered, quickly sobering even Nikita. Trucks and an early count could mean only one thing. The camp rushed to a small parade field, where they quickly fell into neat formation for the daily count. But the prisoners were noticeably nervous as they beheld 3 trucks parked directly behind the camp commissar. Looming ominously in the distance, just a quarter-mile down the front gate in front of them, were the twin smokestacks, still visible in the slowly fading light. The commissar withdrew a clipboard from inside his jacket and quickly thumbed over the pages. Unadulterated terror seemed to sweep over the crowd, though nobody made so much as a sound. Polly clutched her baby tightly to her chest. sheltering it from both the Nazis and the bitter wind under layers of discarded cloth. But the Nazis didn't care, and in an almost bored tone the commissar addressed the crowd. Due to insurgent activity and pressing matters elsewhere, camp funds have been reduced significantly. This merits a similar reduction in personnel who will be relocated. When your name is called, step forward. The terror became thick enough that one might cut it with a knife. All knew what relocation meant. Maybe once the Nazis had been able to obfuscate their exterminations, but now, even in the most remote camps, everyone knew the truth. The commissar thumbed through his list of names, calling out individuals almost at random. More than once, guards had forcibly seized the individual called up, dragging them wailing to the trucks. The rest of the formation stood stock still in silence, hoping against hope their name wouldn't be the next to be called. WWII. From directly behind the couple, Stefan saw Polly shake, as if she'd been physically struck. He had the instinct to move to catch her should she fall, but found that his legs too had turned to ice. Next to her, Tova was similarly frozen, eyes staring straight ahead in dumbfounded horror. Nikita, the old communist just a few bodies left of Stefan, audibly gasped. Stefan expected perhaps the communist would sneer, shake his head in disgust. "Where is your god now?" "WWII!" the commissar shouted angrily. Toba looked down at the infant clutched against Polly's chest. He imagined seeing the child's face through the scraps of cloth, protecting him from the near-zero temperatures. He prayed internally for just one glimpse. Then he sucked in a breath of air and stepped forward. "Here!" The sound came from behind him, and Toba turned in surprise as Stefan broke formation and began to move down the line to the open lane at the formation's left. Stefan slowed, only briefly as he neared the communist, looking him in the eye as he passed. Nikita expected the religious man would sneer, maybe shake his head in disgust at his cowardice. But he didn't. Stefan simply nodded his head and continued on. "Are you WWII?" The commissar looked skeptically at Stefan as he ordered the guards preparing to take him to the truck to stop. "You don't look Roma to me." "I am WWII, Herr Kommissar." The German looked him over, down at the name on his list and then at the assembled crowd of prisoners. Then he simply shrugged his shoulders and made a check mark next to Toba's name. Didn't matter to him who went or not. All that mattered was the books remained balanced. Office of the President of the United States. A single knock on the door alerted President Truman to the knocker's identity even before he ushered the man in. The Secretary of Defense entered at the president's invitation, and Truman offered him a drink. Naturally, Marshall declined it. He couldn't remember if the man was a teetotaler or simply not fond of drinking, but he never accepted it. Was the operation a success? Marshall nodded, but not nearly as quickly as Truman would have liked. Something wasn't quite right. "I'm sure the State Department will be here shortly, no doubt with diplomatic protests from the Germans. But yes, Mr. President, our radio intercepts indicate the Nazis have called a halt to their advance, and there does not appear to be any signs of injury or death amongst their forces, despite the imprecision of the drop. I am told the flight crew did their best. I want them all put up for an award. Make the proper recommendations to the Pentagon." "Yes, Mr. President." Silence for a moment. "All right then, Marshall, out with it. What's the rest?" Marshall was silent for a moment, then sat down warily on one of the chairs in front of the president's desk. "Sir, we had an observation team on the ground, engineers and scientists, escorted by some Army commandos. Same boys that put out the radio beacons to guide the peacemaker in. The eggheads were looking to make observations on the real-world deployment of a nuclear weapon, something that, naturally, they normally wouldn't have the chance to do." Another long pause. "The bomb blew significantly off course, given the circumstances. They were killed, Mr. President." Now it was Truman's turn to sit, the drink he'd been sipping now forgotten in his hand. "I'm told the flight crew did their best, risked their own life." "Yes, Mr. President. My preliminary inquiry indicates this is correct. Conditions on the ground were bad, very bad, Mr. President. And the nature of those regional storms, they're impossible to Marshall, do you know what it's been like to carry the weight of being the man who ordered the atomic bomb dropped not once, but twice in the war? Do you know what they say about me even now? Can you imagine what future historians will say?" Marshall didn't respond. "Now, I've become the first president to not only drop the atomic bomb on an enemy, but to create the first American atomic casualties." There was a long silence in the Oval Office. In the world beyond the half-curved walls of the office of the President of the United States, the grinding gears of American and Nazi bureaucracy, two global superpowers, wore on, each seeking to grind the other down as a priority of national survival. One would hope that they would be merciful in their judgment, given the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in. Mr. President, the Nazi threat is an existential one. not just to the nation, but to the world as we know it. I fear we have averted a third world war, but have entered into a new Cold War and simply punted the ball downfield for now. But that's exactly what you've done, Mr. President. You've bought us time. 1963, Berlin, Third Reich. The small sedan was sitting just as promised, across the street from the ice cream vendor shuttering his small stand as the evening shadows lengthened and darkness fell across the public plaza. The lone tall figure quickened his pace as he absent-mindedly tugged his hat down over his eyes as far as it would go. His American contact had been very clear. By 7:35 p.m., the vehicle and his single opportunity to escape the Reich would be gone. As he neared the vehicle, a man in the front seat opened the passenger side door for him. Without waiting for an invitation, the tall man hurriedly sat himself inside the vehicle. "Pull your hat up. Try to look nonchalant. You look scared." The driver was surprisingly casual as he put the vehicle into drive. He was dressed in a casual suit, typical of the German style of the day for working professionals, with a neat haircut and an easy smile on his face. His window was rolled down to let the cool evening air in as he drove, his arm propped on the windowsill. He didn't know what to expect from the CIA, but he never pictured his flight from the Reich to resemble a casual evening drive. "You have your papers?" The driver cast a glance at the man's briefcase. "Ah, yes, research notes, designs, and specs for the upcoming moon." "No, I mean your identification papers. We'll need them for the checkpoint." The man blushed. "Ah, yes, of course. Always. My family? Last I heard, they were on their way to Morocco. They'll meet you in Florida about a week after you get there." The man nodded grimly. As casual as the American spy seemed to be taking the whole affair, his own nerves were inversely frayed. The American seemed to pick up on this. "You must relax, Herr Doctor." He nodded. 20 minutes later, they reached a small airport near the Berlin outskirts. The city was massive, but traffic flowed neatly and efficiently, just like the Reich itself. A neat, efficient, orderly, utterly cold and inhuman thing. As the sedan approached the checkpoint, he felt his stomach tightening into a knot. "Remember, Herr Doctor, relax." The American smiled wide as they slowed for the waiting guard. The military policeman, a reservist by the look of it, asked for the papers. The American casually offered his own, then motioned to the doctor to present his. He nearly fumbled and dropped them in his nervousness, eliciting a raised eyebrow from the policeman. When he grabbed his papers, though, and brought them to the light to get a closer look, his eyes widened slightly, and he ducked down to look inside the vehicle at the passenger. "Herr Braun, Herr Doctor, my apologies." Dr. Werner von Braun shooed away the man's apologetic look. "Apologies again, Dr. Braun. You're my hero. My kid, all he talks about is space because of you. I'm so sorry, Doctor, but if you have a moment, may I have an autograph for my boy?" Braun nodded, smiling as the happy guard handed him a notepad out of his pocket, typically used to record information for incident reports. He signed the pad obligingly, dedicating the autograph to the guard's son. In the back of his mind, he struggled to suppress a growing sense of betrayal. "Thank you so much, Doctor. Please go ahead. Again, thank you so much." The American politely excused them in a perfectly accented German and pulled away. 15 minutes later, Braun was on a small private plane flying to destinations unknown. He'd only been told what he needed to about his escape plan, no more than that. Washington, D.C., 36 hours later. Dr. Braun sat listlessly in the nondescript office deep in the belly of the CIA. He was growing restless. His journey out of Europe had been circuitous, a private flight to a still neutral Switzerland, well, neutral in name only, and from there a public flight to Egypt under a false identity with some hefty makeup and latex work to conceal his all-too-famous identity. His expectation of the clandestine world of spies and counter-spies had been based on the popular movies of the time, pitting the Sicherheitsdienst up against the clever CIA and their devious plots to undermine the spiritual and physical purity of the Reich. Naturally, these films heavily featured outlandish schemes, such as tainting German genetics with, quote, mongrel blood. These movies became very popular in the Reich, but the real world of espionage had turned out to be terribly mundane. A fake disguise he swore every airport security agent he passed could see right through, followed by a seat on a Deutsche Lufthansa flight to Cairo, then a regional airline connecting him to American-occupied Morocco, and then finally a Delta flight to Washington. He'd expected an escort by expertly trained and lethal CIA agents ready to take down any threat with their bare fists if necessary. Instead, he'd flown alone in economy the entire way. It made sense in a way, just another unimportant face lost in the crowd. He'd been sitting in his office for the better part of an hour, at what he assumed would be his official debriefing. He turned over his briefcase full of schematics and plans for the current and new generation of German long-range rockets, even the Schwerer Adler, the rocket that would put Nazi astronauts on the moon. The Reich had beaten the Americans to space, even beaten them to landing a probe on the Moon, Venus, and Mars. They were set to cement their win in space by landing men on the Moon within 8 years. Braun had been instrumental in the effort, though he'd always been uncomfortable using his knowledge to build weaponized rockets fitted with nuclear weapons that could strike almost anywhere in the United States. It was a means to an end, he told himself. His real passion was space. This was mankind's future. He told himself it didn't matter who ended up making it out there, the United States or the Reich, both would eventually be forgotten to history. But he'd only been able to turn a blind eye to the Reich's horrors for so long, and the recent conquest of the Russian Far East had been the final straw. The Soviets had been crushed at long last, but in this growing age of media, it didn't take long for photo and film evidence of the Reich's cultural programs to make their way out to the wider world. There was no denying the atrocities of Hitler's Third Reich any longer. The door opened suddenly, snapping Braun out of his trance. A man about his age entered the room, smiling at him as he shook his hand and introduced himself as Richard Lowe. The second younger man that had entered remained standing as Lowe sat behind his desk. He did not look nearly as pleased as his partner. Or was it his boss? Braun found it hard to tell. After a few pleasantries, Braun got down to brass tacks. Mr. Lowe, I'm ready to fully cooperate with your intelligence services, or perhaps even NASA itself. I have extensive knowledge of… Yes. We've gone over your literature. We're much obliged for the help, Mr. Braun. We'll be setting you up with an expense account. Not quite what you might be used to back home, but still quite comfortable, I promise you. At least until you find work. Braun was confused. I'm sorry, Mr. Lowe, I don't think I understand. With your expertise, I believe a teaching position should be relatively easy to come across, though I'm not so sure how many universities will be happy to have a Nazi on staff, especially one so famous. Braun moved his mouth like a fish out of water, but no words came out. In all the scenarios he'd gone over during his plan to escape the Third Reich, none of them went anything like this one. He was growing more confused. Mr. Lowe, as I said, I promise you I'm fully prepared to cooperate. We heard you, Doc, and we thank you. It won't be necessary. This time it was the man who'd remained standing who answered, his arms still crossed. Doctor, this is Michael Aguiar. He'll be your liaison during your settling down period. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and a secretary stuck her head in at Lowe's invitation. Sir, reminder as you requested, it's about to air. Yes, thank you, Linda. Lowe turned to the TV in his office and turned it on. The TV clicked as it changed to the expected channel. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, was in the opening lines of a nationwide announcement. Dr. Braun, I believe you'll find this very interesting. Braun did find the speech interesting. The event was being broadcast live, which impressed Braun. He was used to taped conferences in the Reich, which could be better edited for unwanted content. As he watched, Braun felt his heart sink slightly. NASA Chief James E. Webb stood behind the president and in front of a large board, showcasing various diagrams, which, to Braun's trained eye, were immediately obvious. It was a multi-stage mission to the moon. But what impressed him the most was the cutaway to reveal a massive gleaming rocket. They called it the Saturn something. Braun missed the full name in his shock. It was the rocket that would carry Americans to the moon. When do you launch? This time it was Aguiar who answered, with no small amount of smug satisfaction. 2 years, 3 tops. This Saturn can make it all the way to orbit. 311,000 pounds, enough for a lander. Hell, enough for the buggy, they're thinking. Braun shook his head in disbelief. Brain scoop. Excuse me, doctor? Lowe turned the TV volume down slightly. Sorry, German expression. You scooped up talent from all over the world. Of course you did. We made it easy for you. What's the line, Mr. Braun? Amerikanischer Mischling? Yes, mongrels. Braun finally spotted the Hispanic heritage on Aguiar's face. There was another knock at the door. The young secretary stuck her head in again. Mr. Lowe, they're ready. Thank you again, Linda. We'll be right out. Lowe stood and made his way around the desk to help the stupefied Braun out of his chair. I don't understand. What am I here for? Lowe smiled, ushering Braun out of his office to a waiting group of photographers who began to take a flurry of photographs. You're here for photos, Mr. Braun. Remember to smile. Ural Mountains, sometime later. Elsewhere, it was still summer, but in the high overpasses of the Urals, winter was always early. Despite this, the laboring men had taken their jackets off, unloading crates of ammunition, explosives, and supplies from a mule-drawn wagon. Nikita grunted as he removed one of the last remaining wooden crates. The side of the crate had once been stamped with customs information from the port of Los Angeles, far away in California, and receiving information from the Chinese port in Hong Kong. There had been a significant effort made to destroy this stamp, but whoever had done the job hadn't quite succeeded, or cared. This crate would need to be burned. It had been stressed to all the guerrillas how important it was to shield the United States from any culpability in their attacks if they wanted the supplies to keep flowing. He groaned as he tried to pry the lid off, until Gutschlag, one of the Mongolian Borchkas that was part of the group, arrived with a crowbar. The burly man worked at the nails holding the lid shut as Nikita tried to keep the whole crate secure for him. In the effort, Gutschlag spotted a silver crucifix tumble out from underneath Nikita's shirt. With a grunt, he finally opened the lid of the crate, exposing the explosive charges wrapped in waterproof bags and nestled in hay. Nikita gave a low whistle. The Americans have been generous today. Gutschlag nodded his agreement as the men began to remove the explosives. Some they would take with them, others they would leave in secret caches all across the mountains. They worked in silence until Gutschlag nodded at the crucifix still hanging outside Nikita's shirt, unnoticed. Strange to see a communist with a crucifix. Nikita looked down at his collar but did not conceal the crucifix. Communism is dead, comrade. Gutschlag smiled. Okay then, strange to see a man of God handling explosives. Not so strange these days, I think. Didn't your God say, turn the other cheek? Nikita nodded as he put one of the explosive charges along with a detonator into his personal pack. Inside it was a pistol he'd looted from a dead Nazi soldier, along with the first aid kit and ammo for his rifle. The Lord also said, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Gutschlag stopped, confused. Then he gestured at the explosives. How is this living peaceably with the Germans? So far as it depends on you. I didn't choose to be thrown into a camp, friend. I didn't choose to watch the Nazis kill millions of my people. I didn't choose this war. Gutschlag nodded. He was Borchka, or so the Soviets called him. Nobody really knew where the term had come from, but it had been used to describe the many volunteers from across old Russian Far East, Mongolia, and even China who joined the surviving Soviet guerrilla bands in their war against the Nazis. But Gutschlag was also Buddhist. Matter of fact, it was the reason he was here now. Defending oneself and others is good, but violence should be committed without hatred. Do you hate the Nazis for what they have done? Nikita was silent for a long while. I did. Sometimes I still do, but I pray. Gutschlag nodded his agreement. Prayer is good. Meditation, good. Your Lord would make a good Buddhist. Nikita laughed. You Buddhists would make good Christians. Ural Mountains, 73 hours later. Steel and iron screamed in agony as thousands of tons of train and cargo jumped the mountain tracks and crashed into the surrounding landscape. The guerrillas had planned their attack carefully, striking inside a deep gorge that the Nazi rail line cut through. It was one of the furthest points from civilization that the train passed through, delivering coal, oil, and other raw materials from the mines and wells east of the Urals to the massive industrial center the Nazis had grown outside of Moscow. It was a place so remote, Nazi patrols didn't even believe the Soviet guerrillas could reach it, the surrounding countryside being mountains reaching over 10,000 feet each, and nothing so much as a goat trail leading them through here. But the surviving Soviets had learned how to hide from the Nazis after their invasion east of the Urals to crush the remaining Soviet state 4 years ago, and subsequent genocide or mass imprisonment and deportation of the survivors. They'd also learned to go where Nazis couldn't, or wouldn't. They'd become as tough as the mountains through which no road could be cut. The train was not carrying oil, or there would have been a massive explosion by now. That meant that there was opportunity for salvage, and the group of 30-odd guerrillas swarmed out of their hiding places to rush the wreckage below. Figures began to emerge from some of the front cars that weren't fully consumed in flames yet. Survivors in Nazi uniforms. Nikita did not fire at the men pulling themselves from the wreckage, but his compatriots had no such qualms. The survivors fled the approaching flames and pulled themselves from the shattered train cars, only to be cut down by machine gun and rifle fire. A squad of armed guards must have been stationed in one of the carts that hadn't suffered much damage. As soon, the descending guerrillas were under fire themselves. Nikita heard the distinctive oomph sound of someone being shot in the chest near him and dove for cover. He took careful aim and returned fire at a Nazi popping out of the overturned car's window. The man staggered backwards from the impact of the rifle round and collapsed inside. Some of the guerrillas were close enough to use grenades and began to toss some inside the overturned car. Within moments, there was no further resistance, only the moaning of the dying and injured inside the car. Now the guerrillas would turn to stripping the wreckage for anything transportable or worth salvaging. But the overall mission was to shut down the Nazi shipping in the mountains and cause as much economic harm as possible. That was but one of several targeted raids that even now were playing out across the mountains. Surgical strikes against key nodes in the Nazi transportation network. masterminded by the same American Special Forces colonel who had sent the explosives and other supplies Nikita's band had received several days ago. The US and the Third Reich were technically at peace. Technically. Nikita didn't join his comrades in stripping the train. Instead, he searched for the man he'd heard to be wounded in the attack. They all wore rock gray uniforms with flecks of brown and green, special camo once more provided by the Americans to help them blend in with the mountainsides, so it took a bit of searching. When Nikita found the man, his heart dropped. Gotchlug had mercifully died quickly. Nikita spotted 2 bullet holes, one right over the heart. He groaned as he sat next to his Mongolian friend, both from his emotional pain and the exertion on his 50-year-old stiffening joints. With a shaking hand, he closed the dead man's eyes, then gently patted his friend on the head. "Father, I know what the word says, but…" Nikita wiped his face with a dirt-caked hand, then shook his head slowly. "But I also know your heart. Accept this good man." The old former communist sighed, leaning back against a large rock. He should be helping below, but he just didn't have the energy right now. And he didn't want to see any more dead bodies, even if they were Nazis. "I'm tired, Lord. So very tired." Despite himself, Nikita cried. Werder, Germany, 14 miles outside Berlin. Irma smiled as she'd been taught to, eliciting a reciprocal smile from the assembled adults. This included her mother and father, as well as her grandmother, aunt, and her husband. But assembled in the large flower garden also was an entire family that she did not know. Not yet, anyway. It was only a matter of time until Irma got to know her future family-in-law. At 10 years old, Irma was following the new customs of the Third Reich. It wasn't assigned marriage, not exactly, but rather a careful selection that began as early as her 8th birthday, with extensive genealogical and genetic research in conjunction with the officials from the Office of Cultural Advancement. The entire affair was the pride of Heinrich Himmler's efforts to distill the purest Aryan Germans possible with the help of modern science. The man was so proud of the OCA, in fact, that he'd only partially resigned from his general governmental duties to take personal charge of the office. Hitler, who died when Irma was just 2 years old, had called the effort the great guarantor of the Third Reich's 1,000-year reign. The ultimate result was the most optimal pairing of new generations of Germans in an effort that the authorities knew was increasingly unpopular with the people, but one they promised would not be permanent. Within 3 generations, we will have a Germany so pure that marriage will naturally be a matter of choice once more. But for now, we must bear the burden of laying the foundations of our children's glorious future. So had said Himmler in one of his latest television addresses. For Irma, though, this was simply the way the world was, and she smiled obediently as she'd been taught to her soon-to-be family-in-law. Eckhard was her same age, and it seemed amicable enough when they'd been introduced. Her mother told her that she was lucky. Eckhard had good features and an excellent family lineage. He would grow up to be a handsome and successful husband. "Irma, darling, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Her future mother-in-law leaned down and smiled warmly, offering her a candy. Irma gladly accepted it, and the adults laughed to themselves as she greedily ate the small chocolate. "I want to be a doctor, like my mother." Irma's mother beamed proudly. "Your marks at school are excellent, or so I'm told. I'm sure you'll be a fine doctor. And Eckhart will make a fine officer. What a splendid family we'll have." Her future mother-in-law smiled, and the adults all nodded in agreement. Their marriage was still 8 years away, and during that time the two families would spend time together on holidays and trips to deepen the bonds between them. Germany is family, so the Reich's propaganda ministry continuously said, and special government programs mandated holidays and vacation time for family bonding. The sun was warm in the late summer, the flowers blooming all around the two families. The garden, like the Reich itself, was a wonderfully manicured, beautiful, pleasant place to be. Irma was happy. The White House, United States of America. President John F. Kennedy turned the TV off, switching his attention back to his Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson. The news had just run another feature on America's upcoming moon mission, NASA proudly displaying the large Saturn rocket that would soon begin testing. The development had been kept a secret from the world, even the Nazis, who until just a few days ago had believed their rocket program was superior to the Americans. Johnson turned to Kennedy with a large grin on his face. "I talked to Cooper over at the CIA. Says Brown was blindsided. Nazis never saw this coming." Kennedy leaned back, allowing himself a pleased smile. The United States was engaged in a dangerous affair. The big Saturn rocket that could put American astronauts on the moon could also put nuclear weapons into orbit. dozens of them right over German heads. Would the space race remain about space, even as the Americans were poised to win? Or did he just ring the opening bell of a new nuclear arms race in orbit? I'm sure Herr Doctor was disappointed. Braun had claimed that all he ever cared about was man's future in space. But whether he meant it or not, his work had directly helped the Nazis hold the United States under threats of hundreds of ballistic missiles loaded with nuclear weapons. The only way the United States had leveled the playing field until now had been with superior air fleets of strategic bombers and hundreds more nukes than the Nazis had in their own arsenals. Wernher von Braun's contributions to human spaceflight were over. The man had probably expected to put his name on history when he defected. Instead, he'd served as propaganda, taking pictures for the papers to show off another prize the US managed to snag away from Nazi Germany. Have you considered authorizing Project Bluebird? Johnson motioned at a recently unsealed file on the president's desk. It was marked all over with classification ratings, the largest of which read "Eyes Only" in big red letters across the front. It had been hand-delivered by the director of the National Security Agency. The contents of the folder spelled out a systematic campaign to expose Nazi atrocities to the world by media manipulation both at home and abroad. It included details on the Nazi exploitation of occupied territories, along with rather unsavory photos smuggled out of both detention and extermination camps, with promises of video evidence of Nazi efforts to exterminate undesirable populations both at home and abroad. It was all an open secret, of course, but one that the world had not acknowledged to date, leaving most to consider it largely rumor or conspiracy. Project Bluebird threatened to expose what the Nazis termed its cultural advancement program for what it really was, and hopefully in a way that didn't directly implicate the United States government. Kennedy had been considering Johnson's question, then finally nodded over at the now powered-down television set. I think we've provoked the Nazis enough for my first term. Let's save it for my re-election. Johnson frowned, clearly displeased with the answer. Mr. President, let me be clear. I think the American people are fine people. We have some of, if not the brightest minds in the world, the hardest workers anywhere. But were you aware a full 25% of the design team on the Saturn was naturalized Americans? Would have been more if not for the strict classification and stringent background checks to help keep a lid on the whole thing. And that's just the Saturn project, Mr. President. At least 40% of NASA and its civilian contractor ecosystem are all naturalized citizens or awaiting citizenship. Kennedy nodded knowingly. Lyndon, I'm not blind to the great boon immigration has been to this nation. Immigration fueled by Nazi atrocities and racism. Kennedy nodded again. I understand what you're saying, and I agree. Hell, the more atrocities those sons of bitches get, the more talent they drive straight into our arms. But we just put our dick on the table, Lyndon, and it's a hell of a lot bigger than theirs. We need time to play this thing out and manage any escalation before upping the ante once more. Retirement term. Retirement term was the colloquial term used to describe a re-elected president's second term, when he would no longer be up for re-election and had far greater freedom to pursue riskier domestic and foreign policy options. Fine, but John, I got something for you that can't wait for retirement. Kennedy's eyebrow raised. There was another lynching down in Georgia, more protests, small this time, but dogs, horses, the whole works nonetheless. I got people talking to the local authorities. Might have been a judge involved in the lynching, apparently. FBI's opening a federal investigation into the matter. Nobody's too happy over the whole damn thing. Kennedy nodded knowingly. Good, I don't give a damn who did the lynching. Judge, police commissioner, hell, the state governor. I want a photo of them in cuffs with FBI agents behind them on the front page of every paper across this country. I've got good people on it, but there's more. This needs to stop, John. The Saudis, Iranians, hell, the whole world is looking at us and looking at the Nazis and wondering how one's better than the other. If we want to keep the Nazis out of the Middle East and contain them everywhere else without a war, we need to show the world why we're different. You think we can get a civil rights amendment past this Congress? I think we can make a case directly to the American people, so they know who to get angry at if they don't. Kennedy was quiet for a long while. The weight of the world and his nation's future pressed heavy on the youngest president to date's shoulders. Okay, but we need a face, someone to champion this whole thing, and it's got to be an African-American man. Can't be a white man leading this charge. Won't be sympathetic with voters. Johnson leaned back in his chair, smiling at last. I know just the man for the job. Baptist preacher speaking on behalf of the NAACP in August. I think he should be at that rally, John, as he delivers his speech. I think it could change history. 1976, 67 miles off the southern coast of Cyprus. The first 12 Tomcats screamed ahead, to provide a screen for the rest of the deploying F-14s. The Combat Air Patrol had already expended their load of long-range missiles and was beating a hasty retreat to rearm and get back in the sky, though the fight probably wouldn't last long enough for that to matter. The big birds had transitioned into a swept-wing flight as they gained speed and hit over Mach 1.5 at 50,000 feet. The powerful WWII radars in their nose cones swept the skies in front of them, easily identifying the massing threat chasing the returning Cap at full speed. AIM-54 Phoenix missiles dropped off the rails of a dozen Tomcats in quick succession. The storm of missiles climbed nearly vertically into the sky, rocketing upwards for altitude. At 97,000 feet, the missiles leveled out and screamed ahead toward the incoming German aircraft. The Phoenix's impressive 1,000-pound warhead was meant to punch German bombers out of the sky before they could unleash swarms of anti-ship missiles on U.S. carriers. But against faster, more maneuverable targets, the beefy missiles had great difficulty keeping up. Screaming down from above on the enemy, the missile had massive amounts of energy, but as the air grew thicker at lower altitudes, the big missile becomes sluggish and easily notched or avoided. Predictably, the Phoenix missiles did little to stem the German assault, though it did slow it. Each Tomcat could lead multiple Phoenixes to their targets, a capability the Germans couldn't match. The leading edge of the German attack was either destroyed or more commonly disrupted, as the nimble Me-464s dove to the deck to confuse and avoid the missiles. At this point, it was all about slowing down the assault until the entire air wing could get into the sky. As the leading edge of both sides neared, AIM-7 Sparrows were the first to reach the Germans. Unlike the Phoenix, the Sparrow was deadly. Light and highly maneuverable, even ace pilots would be hard-pressed to notch the American missile. But the Germans were flying extremely low, causing massive backscatter on American radars. Small and nimble, the Me-464s were confounding even the American E-1 Tracer, flying deep in the rear and overwatching the battlefield with its powerful radar. It kept the Germans safe from the Tomcats' look-down, shoot-down capability, but it was risky. One aircraft flew too low, clipping the top of a freakishly tall wave and tearing itself to pieces. It was also hell on the mileage. The low-flight maneuver through thick atmosphere guzzled up fuel at a much faster rate, costing the Germans valuable loiter time in the combat area. As the two forces began to merge, the 61,000-pound Tomcats had the energy advantage, thanks to twin afterburning General Electric F-110s. The twin engines powered the Tomcats through curves, slicing off German fighters and bringing them down with sidewinders or even guns. But the Germans outnumbered the F-14s and overwhelmed them. The Tomcat was more powerful, but the lighter Me-464 could recover energy quicker, outmaneuvering their American counterparts. 5 of the first wave of Tomcats managed to limp away. Some had fired their Phoenixes off, even if there was no chance of hitting their target, just to lighten the plane. The second wave, however, went full interceptor mode, the powerful radar on the E-1 picking up a track on German bombers. The Tomcats' record in a dogfight was debatable, but in the interceptor role, there was no peer. The supersonic aircraft were bred for this, screaming out at Mach 2.2 and firing their big Phoenixes from over 70 miles away. One by one, the German bombers got smacked out of the sky by the big 130-pound warhead. The German fighter cover was thick, though, and several Tomcats were shot out of the sky before they could fire their missiles. 3 German bombers survived the merciless onslaught of Phoenixes and Tomcats to drop 6 large jet-powered anti-ship missiles. The missiles packed over 800 pounds of explosives each and dove from the sky to level out at 25 feet off the top of the ocean. They were flying on data link now, led to the general location of the American carrier battle group. Once near enough, though, they turned on their own powerful radars, popping up to just over 50 meters. The carrier's escorts began to put up screens of interceptor missiles, and pursuing F-14s even managed to blow one out of the sky with a sidewinder. Free Libya, WWII. The German blitzkrieg was stalling out only a dozen miles past former American lines. In anticipation of an overwhelming land assault, U.S. forces had deployed across multiple lines of defense. Surprising the Germans, they hadn't deployed their M60 main battle tanks on the primary or even second line of defense, opting instead for use of lighter M551 Sheridans on the front. The nimble Sheridans were there to stem the German assault and use their superior mobility to avoid being decisively engaged. Hiding behind the various tank fortifications, the Sheridans used their shillelagh anti-tank missiles to destroy heavy German tanks, leading the charge. And while their 152mm guns lacked range, they were deadly against lighter armed infantry fighting vehicles. With 9 shillelagh missiles each, the Sheridans beat a hasty retreat once their missiles were spent. Ground-based air defenses coordinated closely with U.S. Air Force fighters to deconflict the fiercely contested airspace over the front line. The Germans had the advantage over F-4 Phantoms with their nimbler Me-464s and the much-feared Focke-Wulf 261s. The 261s were Germany's latest offering, a nimble and speedy fighter, the Germans preferring agility for air-to-air dogfighting superiority. However, the newly introduced F-15s on the American side were a contingency the Germans were unprepared for. Only 2 squadrons were operational in this section of the front. The aircraft rushed into initial operational capability just a year ago as tensions between the United States of America and the German Third Reich heated to a boil. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the F-15s were proving deadly over the Libyan deserts. Criticized for being too large to dogfight, the F-15's superior radar allowed it to swat German fighters out of the air at range, and then took German pilots by surprise with its close-quarters agility. But on the ground, the advantage was in Nazi Germany's hands, though significantly eroded due to America's nimble and agile defenses and exhaustive fortifications. By the time the main German force had penetrated the third line of defense, they found themselves up against a wall of M60 tanks. German tanks were larger, more heavily armored, specifically built for the desert battlefields of North Africa and the Middle East, where the Reich foresaw it'd be fighting the Americans and its allies. There was little cover here, so German tanks packed over 20 tons more armor and armament than even the hefty M60s. The 2 tank forces slugged it out in a grudge match over a decade in the making. German tanks could fire from further away, but American tanks were more accurate and mobile. They fought a decisive battle, moving from one pre-built defensive position to another, trading territory for blood. Berlin, German Third Reich, 2 weeks later. Irma gnawed on the tip of her pencil nervously. It was a tic she'd developed after her first contact with war casualties. She'd always dreamt of going to medical school, and with her good scores and keen intellect, she easily placed within one of the Reich's medical training programs. With her campus adjacent to one of Berlin's largest hospitals, her class had been swiftly recruited to aid medical professionals as the first casualties from the Africa and Middle Eastern fronts had been flown in. It wasn't that blood made her squeamish. She probably would have never made a good doctor if it did. It was the trauma the men had suffered, and often continued to suffer. These were the worst of the worst casualties, hastily medevaced out of field hospitals for treatment in the best-equipped hospitals in the Reich. And the treatment was quite good. There was little doubt that the Reich's medical programs were decades more advanced than anywhere else on Earth, even America. The Americans may have beat the Germans to space and taken the lead in a disturbing number of fields, but the world's top doctors and hospitals were all in Germany. A team of doctors burst out of the surgery theater, snapping her out of her thoughts. She nodded to the other 2 student nurses, who all put their masks and rubber gloves on, then stepped inside. Under the direction of a senior nurse who looked exhausted enough to collapse, they began their work sewing up the doctor's handiwork. The surgeons were stretched to the breaking point, and things had gotten bad enough that they simply moved from patient to patient, leaving work that would normally be conducted by well-trained and experienced professionals to students. Irma ignored the horrific network of stitches growing across the mercifully unconscious soldier's body. It'd be difficult to even call it a body anymore. It looked like he'd been inside an armored vehicle when he got hit. He had lost both legs, one at the knee, and the other the surgeons had to cut off at the hip. His right arm had suffered severe third-degree burns, but miraculously he would be saved thanks to new treatments developed in German medical labs. His left arm was missing a hand. It had been blown off in the attack. She didn't look at his face, not because she was fearful of what damage she might find there, but because she didn't want to turn this piece of flesh she was busily sewing up into a person with a face and a name and a family and a life. They worked quickly but accurately. The students were all chosen for this task because of their skill. All day long they moved from one theater to another, hastily patching up the surgeons' work as the Third Reich's overstretched medical resources struggled to keep up with demand. The nation had underestimated the cost of modern war, and Irma thought that the Americans too must be overwhelmed. The fighting had lasted only a week and a half, though most people were calling it the 2-week war, but the casualties had been mounting at a ferocious rate. Thankfully, no weapons of mass destruction had been used so far, but Irma and her family still lived in constant fear of American biological or nuclear weapons dropping any day now. The world had averted a nuclear showdown, and the conflict remained conventional, costing a shocking 20,000 lives for both sides in just 2 weeks of fighting. By the time it got dark, her shift was over. A gaggle of real nurses congregated at the bus shelter as Irma took her place. The older women looked at her suspiciously, then hastily around at their surroundings. and deciding it was all clear and Irma was no threat, a few cigarettes began to be passed around. Soon the air was thick with their smoke. Smoking wasn't technically illegal in the Third Reich. Those restrictions had been loosened after Hitler's death, but it was significantly frowned upon. Anything that diluted the Aryan body or spirit was frowned upon. "Want to try?" One of the women offered a cigarette to Irma, but she quickly shook her head no. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "You assisted one of my patients today. You did good work." For the life of her, Irma couldn't place the nurse's face. Most of the staff she interacted with wore a mask all day anyway, and that only made remembering names and faces even more difficult. It was the young boy, missing legs, burned arm. Recognition dawned on Irma. She had no idea how old the soldier was that she'd been working on. She never looked at faces if she could help it. "Will he keep it at least, the arm, I mean?" The nurse nodded. "For what it's worth. Couldn't save the legs. Came in with no hand, but he'll keep that arm. Might even be usable too. It's a wonder what you the medicine can accomplish." Irma looked confused. What did the Jews have to do with his arm? As far as Irma knew, the only Jews left in the Reich were former Soviet citizens in the work camps of the Far East. The Reich Minister of Labor had updated the nation on the process of assimilating the surviving Jewish population into society, but warned that the immoral taint ran deep in the blood and would require multiple generations to extinguish. Same with the communists. Irma thought it was good that they were given a chance to one day have their children and grandchildren join the Reich, once they'd been properly sanitized of antisocial ideologies and blood, of course. "He's enjoying a new treatment that has promise of regrowing tissue, recently developed with the help of Jewish and communist subjects." Irma's confusion amused one older nurse. "Darling, they need someone to try new medicine before using it on people." Recognition dawned on Irma's face. There was no mention of this in any of the public programming on the re-education efforts taking place in the Far East and abroad. "German medicine's the best in the world. We'll save many of those boys, might even fix a few of them to be like they used to." The older nurse seemed proud. Somewhere deep inside, a sliver of horror grew in the pit of Irma's stomach. Wuhai, northern China. What happens when someone who isn't Christian dies? The question made Nikita wince. Not so much because of the hotly debated theological implications, but because the young student had chosen to ask it right as the dean had arrived. The American priest was on the leading edge of China's growing Americanization, as the nation rapidly modernized in the wake of winning the Civil War against the communists. The latter had fled to Taiwan, which China vowed to return to the fold eventually. But in a twist of irony so intense it had made Nikita's head hurt, the communists had the support of the Nazis, including many modern weapons that would have made an invasion painful if not impossible. Then there was the actual Nazis themselves, just on the other side of Nepal, in what used to be British-administered India. The mountains were a strong barrier to conflict, protecting China's democratic government that had rapidly modernized the nation with huge financial assistance from its ally and partner, the United States. Despite his years of tending to the spiritual needs of his former guerrilla compatriots, this had been Nikita's first contact with the official church. American Christian ministries had spread deep into China and found a spiritually hungry population in search of meaning after nearly 2 decades of bloody civil war. Nikita was grateful for his newfound job of teaching local students at the Christian school. Spending time as a guerrilla across North Asia fighting the Germans meant you had to learn a dizzying array of languages to survive and coordinate, and Nikita had proven an apt teacher too. But this question threatened to upend the small peace he'd found in his new life, and Nikita knew it. He glanced at the dean, now leaning into the classroom expectantly by the front door. The institution taught traditional Christianity, straight from the book, so to speak, but Nikita's Christian education had come on the front lines across 20 years of war. The spiritual lessons taught there often clashed with the neat, clean, and pristine doctrine taught in places far, far from the violence and horrors of war. "Lord, not me, but you," Nikita prayed inwardly, a prayer of submission. Not his knowledge and wisdom, but God's. With a final glance at the dean, he turned his attention back to the young Chinese student. The Lord loves all equally, no matter race, religion, or nation. When his son sacrificed his own life to take on God's wrath at human sin, he paid for all people. The dean cleared his throat, as if to speak, but was interrupted by another eager student. "Lao Shi, why was God angry at the world?" Despite knowing he'd probably secured his own termination from his teaching position, Nikita chuckled. He wasn't angry at the world, Mao Song. He was angry at sin, evil. What happens when you mix oil and water? "They don't mix," came several students' voices simultaneously. And so God and evil can't mix. God had to punish evil, but didn't want to punish you directly for doing it. Nikita couldn't help but glance down at his hands. There were few men who could ever be truly grateful for the tenet of grace. but a soldier could be. So, bad people go to heaven? Nikita drew in a breath to speak but was interrupted by the dean, who ushered him outside. Nikita frowned, taking in what would be the last sight of the children he'd come to enjoy teaching so much. Once the door was shut and the students were out of earshot, the dean spoke. "You've been warned before, Nikita. We do not teach universalism here. We teach straight from the Bible." Nikita cut him off. "Once I held a dying man in my hands, enemy, a German. Something made me wipe the dirt off his face and I realized he was just a boy, 18, 19 maybe. Do you know what I saw in his face?" The dean grimly shook his head no. Fear, regret, pain. The boy didn't know why he was where he was, so far from home, trying to kill me and my comrades. He was only there because he'd been taught we were evil, because he believed we were. Do you think God sent that boy to hell? The dean said nothing at first. "Nikita, I'm sorry. You've been warned. We can ill afford to establish bad dogma so early, and I understand. I'm grateful. I enjoyed it here." Nikita nodded his goodbye, then returned one last time to the classroom to retrieve his belongings. He smiled at the children as he left. Outside the religious academy, the small town was bustling. There was a furor of activity that started shortly after the 2-week war had ended, and Nikita began to see a lot of American faces, a lot of American military uniforms as well. The Chinese and Americans were building a series of new bases all across northern China, he learned. This put U.S. ground forces within 100 miles of some of the Reich's richest oil and gas fields in the former Russian Far East. Perhaps that's why he wasn't completely surprised by the two smartly dressed American men who approached him. They looked like businessmen, but maybe it was instincts developed by 2 decades of guerrilla warfare because Nikita already knew they were CIA men. He'd become familiar with the intelligence organization thanks to the U.S. funneling millions of supplies to the various rebel and terrorist groups waging war on the Reich. At their polite invitation, Nikita would follow the two men to a private dinner destination. There, he would agree to assist the men. He was physically well past fighting age, as he pushed his late 60s, but the experience fighting Germans in the Far East was invaluable. Secret routes through border areas, weapon and supplies caches that were still hidden across the vast Russian mountains. Nikita would end up taking a completely different teaching position that day, but he always missed his old one. Montgomery, Alabama, Eric Johnson election campaign speech. "Are you hearing this? Are you hearing what I'm hearing?" Eric Johnson played to the crowd expertly. First, he got them into a patriotic frenzy. Then he would outrage them and then offer the obvious solution. It was the least sophisticated version of PSYOPs he'd ever studied, and it was embarrassingly effective. Spy agencies around the world had spent fortunes figuring out how to influence people, and here he was doing it in 3 easy, repeatable steps. He was now moving on to step 2. "I'm hearing from all these generals, all these great generals, American heroes, all of them, and they're saying to me, 'Mr. Johnson, we couldn't win because we didn't have the right stuff. Nobody gave it to us.'" Johnson had never talked to a general in his life. At least, not an American one, but that didn't matter. Nobody would fact-check him as long as he said what they wanted to hear. And you know why they didn't have the stuff they needed, folks? You know why we lost the 2-week war so bad? So badly, too. Some are calling it the biggest defeat in U.S. history. The crowd was reaching a fever pitch. Johnston could practically call for an insurrection right now, and these thousands of American patriots would all turn into traitors. How many billions of Reichsmarks had been spent trying to attack people psychologically, even psychically? Anything that held even the smallest promise of swaying the masses. Because it's all going to China. The crowd broke into outrage, like a roller coaster tipping over the edge of that first big fall. Sometimes Johnson felt like a maestro playing the crowd along in an easy 3-beat tune. "Folks, we gotta get the trash out of Washington. We gotta stop with the special interests. And we gotta stop being the piggy bank of the world. They're laughing at us. We're building skyscrapers in China while our army doesn't have the tanks they need. They're laughing at us. China's laughing. Germany's laughing." The crowd's furor was palpable. Johnson had ridden a wave of outrage from an innocuous start as a random businessman to an overnight political sensation that was slated to easily win his seat and represent Alabama in the U.S. Congress. "America first, folks. America first." The crowd broke into a roar that shook the auditorium's walls themselves. The fury of the crowd was so intense, and Johnson so caught up in the moment, that he had to fight down and resist the urge to extend his arm and Sieg Heil. Of all the things he missed most from home was the political passion of the German people. This pathetic campaign stop in his election to U.S. Congress, with a crowd of perhaps a paltry few thousand, couldn't even begin to match the furor of some of the smallest grand parades back home through Victory Row. The route was particularly popular for political parades and rallies, due to being topped off by the French Arc de Triomphe, ripped out of the ground by Nazi engineers and placed there in Berlin, hundreds of miles from Paris. The monument had always been Johnson's favorite, a reminder of the grand revenge enacted on the nation that tried to break Germany and its people with the Treaty of Versailles. 1987, Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, Department of State, Washington, D.C. The door to the skiff slid closed with an airtight swoosh. While it was unlikely a spy could penetrate deep into the basement of the State Department building and plant a bug there, the U.S. took every precaution when it came to protecting its most sensitive information. The Secretary of State's voice sounded oddly muffled, as did all the other sounds inside the skiff, thanks to the secretive silencing technology employed to prevent any outside eavesdropping. The sound insulation was so good that pre-recorded noises of ventilation at low volume had to be played to prevent significant mental effects from the extreme silence that would otherwise overwhelm anyone inside the room. From the outside, there wasn't even a hint of vibration caused by sound waves inside to prevent even advanced laser-based eavesdropping devices from working. I want options on the table, both kinetic and non-kinetic, to take to the president. You have exactly 10 minutes. The Secretary of State sat, though he didn't bother to remove his jacket. The 10-minute threat was all too real. The first to respond was a representative from the Joint Chiefs. The situation was still evolving and information was scarce. This meeting was but one of several similar meetings currently taking place across the highest levels of the American government. The one-star Army general was unfazed by the Secretary's rush. He hadn't made it this high up the chain of command by giving in to pressure. Mr. Secretary, hard-on-the-ground intelligence is still being accumulated as we speak. We know that at least 5 people have been taken, and 1 is suspected to have been killed. The situation is uncertain. Might have been an escape attempt, perhaps in the initial struggle. Surviving victims include a mother and father and their 2 teenage children. A specialist from the State Department's Hostage Crisis Team, a recently established office given the spike in international kidnappings of American and partner country nationals, interrupted. We're in contact with the family stateside now, still developing the full picture. We have photos and even some home movies for the press soon, but it sounds like the family was on vacation. What's the host nation's response? The Secretary of State was poring over a printout highlighting what the hostage team had gathered so far on the family. It would all be used to construct a plan on what to do next. The press would be given photos and footage of the family. Having home movies was a big help. Hostage rescue was as much a matter of negotiation as the use of force and outright propaganda to garner sympathy. The family was on vacation in Angola, got snatched up from one of the coastal resorts. Iron Eagle's claiming responsibility. The hostage team representative handed out photos of the family he'd printed out. The family was mixed. The father was white and the mother black, with 2 children whose features made it obvious they were mixed. It was easy to see why the Iron Eagle, an extremist Nazi terrorist group, had targeted them. The group was on a self-imposed crusade against what they called the, quote, mongrel races of the world. Unsatisfied with the status quo reached between the Third Reich and the United States in the wake of the 2-week war, Iron Eagle had exploded in popularity inside the Reich. They took on their government's campaign for purity outside the borders of the Reich, or sometimes inside of it, given that it hadn't taken long for Germany to realize if it exterminated everyone who wasn't Aryan enough in occupied territories, there would be nobody left to work in their factories and their industry would collapse. For anyone affiliated with Iron Eagle, though, this was an unacceptable compromise, and attacks even inside the Reich against minority populations were common. Now it was the one-star general's turn to interrupt. They crossed the border 16 hours ago. We got good intel on where they holed up as of 10 hours ago. Might still be there. Satellite was retasked for an overflight, and we got some good photos thanks to the clear weather. The general handed out his own printout, this time satellite imagery of what appeared to be a remote and now defunct plantation just miles from the Angola border. After the Second World War, Germany had taken over the Belgian Congo and instituted a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign. This was what led to the realization that the Germans couldn't simply murder everyone, as there'd be nobody left to work. Still, this realization came too late in the case of the Congo, and subsequently many of the country's once extremely productive plantations and mines were abandoned. What help can we get from the Krauts? This time, the secretary's question was aimed at a member of the diplomatic staff assigned to the Third Reich. The young man seemed overwhelmed at first. It was obvious that this was his first time in such a high-level meeting. But given the flurry of diplomatic efforts currently underway, he seemed to be the only member with a high enough clearance that the team could spare to send. Gathering himself, he cleared his throat and answered the secretary's question. Yes, sir. We're not getting much. The Germans say they don't have enough law enforcement presence in the borderlands to be of much help. Bullshit! There was a general scuff around the room, but the outburst came from the head of the hostage crisis team. "We know they use these groups. They might as well be an extension of Berlin itself. That being so, they're even more unlikely to help with a negotiation or a rescue effort." The young diplomat looked apologetic. The rest of the room, however, were the stoic masks of men with decades of the highest echelons of power. "Negotiation directly with the Iron Eagle is off the table. President will never go for that. And it violates our own deterrence policy. So unless someone has any leverage we can apply on the Reich itself, I want to hear the kinetic options." There was silence around the room until a representative from the Department of Commerce spoke up. "We could threaten significant sanctions on electronic chips. China would only be too happy to comply, given tensions in South Asia. The Reich produces their own, but none of the highest quality. Us, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese provide nearly 90% of the advanced chips they use." The secretary nodded. This was an answer he liked, and it had been something he'd been pressuring the president on for months. Everyone knew the future was digital, and locking the Reich out of that future, or at least slowing their ascension to it, was a matter of vital national interest in the secretary's opinion. Plus, a lot of new American military hardware depended heavily on ever more powerful electronics. He saw no reason why the United States should be helping equip its chief rival. "Perfect. Now let's talk kinetic options." The secretary turned toward the one-star general and an admiral sitting next to him. He knew the rear admiral by name. The man had previously commanded an amphibious assault group stationed in American Algeria. He'd recently been transferred to Joint Special Operations Command and represented JSOC at the table today. The admiral motioned at the printouts from the latest satellite pass. "We'll have an infrared bird over the site in another hour or so. Too low resolution for much detail, but a good chance we'll be able to identify human activity. To get more granular, we'll need something overhead." The one-star general interrupted. "That'd be a problem. Might be a border area, but it's still well within the German air defense network. After the war, given the success of our air forces, they doubled down in the region. There's no chance of getting eyes up there without permission from the Germans. We have some capability to penetrate German skies." The admiral's face remained blank, despite the raising of eyebrows across the room, including intensely denied airspace, for a short time. "I'm afraid we'll have to discuss the details in a different briefing, with the properly cleared personnel." Given the disappointment on many of the faces of the skiff, including the Army general, not many here would be a part of that meeting. The secretary nodded knowingly. He wasn't clear on the details, but he's heard rumors that the United States had some sort of aircraft, or multiple types of aircraft, that were extremely difficult to track and spot. The admiral continued his briefing. "We could likely insert a rescue team via halo and wingsuits from a drop inside of Angola airspace, have them land at the border and thus keep the delivery aircraft well within Angola to avert suspicion from German radar surveillance. They can trek the 10 or so miles in. Problem's extraction. There's no telling how many Iron Eagles are within rapid response range. Smart money is they'd have at least 2 or 3 rapid response teams at squad size or more. We've confirmed they have enough manpower in the area to conduct patrols and raids on local communities across the border. Even flying low, helicopters are going to be a problem. Air defense is bound to eventually pick them up. We could use Rangers." The one-star's suggestion was not a bad one, though sending in half a company of Army Rangers would basically trigger a second war with the Reich, as it'd be impossible to keep covert. The secretary shook his head emphatically. "No, this needs to be as quiet as possible. Delta, SEALs, Special Activities, we need a small team that can get in and out with as little noise as possible, at least initially. We can make a bang on the way out as long as we don't give the Reich any diplomatic ammo to shoot at the president. Your means of penetrating German airspace, can it deliver fire support?" The admiral's expressionless mask never shifted. "I can better answer that question at a separate briefing, Mr. Secretary. In America's vast black world, its extensive secret defense industry and military operations, that answer was as good as a confirmation." Some of the meeting's attendees, those without the required clearances, looked impressed. America couldn't just penetrate German air defenses, it might even be able to destroy them. That would have been a handy capability in the 2-week war a decade ago. "Fine then." The secretary rose, gathering what few things he had brought into the skiff with him. The rest of the room rose with him, recognizing the meeting was over and preparing for the scramble to get back to their respective departments and agencies to arrange contingencies for other possible scenarios. "I'll brief the president with what we got so far. Those of you heading up to the big house with me, you know who you are, can take my motorcade. We're leaving in 5. The room scrambled into action, a few of the senior people in it moving with much greater sense of urgency than the rest. 5 minutes was barely enough time to clear the multiple security checkpoints between the basement skiff and the garage. Berlin, Third Reich. Irma's day had been bad. as they tended to be more often than not lately. She fumed internally over a normally insignificant spat with a coworker that blew up out of proportion due to the stress of so many things seemingly going wrong all at once. That's probably why she didn't hear the figure coming up behind her as she was walking to her car on the 3rd floor of the hospital parking lot. The ski-masked figure snatched her from behind and threw their hand over her mouth. A second figure rushed up and painfully stabbed the barrel of a handgun into her ribs. "Scream and I'll shoot." Irma did try to scream, though it was an instinctual move. The hand over her mouth tightened and the pistol pushed more painfully into her side. A trained spy or a military special operator might have realized then and there that the gunman had no real intention to shoot her, and would have probably known that in these kinds of situations, they usually don't. But Irma wasn't a trained spy or special operator. She was a 32-year-old senior nurse with a failing marriage and a 3rd miscarriage in as many years. A vehicle Irma couldn't quite see behind her hurried up to them and stopped with a squeal, followed by a sound of a door opening and hushed shouts of "Get her in! Get her in!" Again, had she been anyone with any level of training, she would have probably realized these people were not professionals, and she might have been better served simply to try to fight her way out. They likely wouldn't want the attention that a murder would bring them. Irma was shoved into the vehicle, and an unseen figure placed a sack over her head. There wasn't much talking as the vehicle sped away. Irma could feel the vehicle take 3 curved ramps that took the vehicle to street level, speeding away into the busy thoroughfare directly in front of the hospital. She still wasn't a trained specialist, but she was clever. Clever enough to know that the interior windows must be heavily tinted as she felt no glare from the sun, and clever enough to start a mental timer of each turn they made. That way, she might be able to approximate how far away these people were taking her and in what direction. The bag was ripped off her head suddenly, and Irma was right. The vehicle was in fact heavily tinted. She was sitting in the back seat between 2 masked figures. The driver up front was unmasked, but the rearview mirror was turned so she couldn't see his face. The passenger, a smaller female Irma guessed, was masked. She shoved several photographs into her hands. "Look at these." Irma didn't need the invitation. The photographs horrified her, and the implication of the photographs horrified her even more. "What do you see?" the masked female asked her. People at a hospital? I don't know." "No, what do you see? Tell me exactly what's going on in each photograph." Irma stammered, not out of fear. All fear over her kidnapping had vanished over the horror of what she held. And the excitement? It was an open secret after all. But nobody outside of the various medical programs knew really what went on, and nobody had any hard proof. Irma was holding in her hands the power to expose the truth about the entire Nazi medical enterprise to the world. She began to describe the photograph that was currently at the top. It's a man. His body has been separated into various marked areas. Looks like limbs and locations of major organs. Some of these are burned, some only a little. Others show clear signs of 3rd-degree burning. It's disgusting. The woman, maybe a girl, thought Irma based on her voice, couldn't be older than 25, nodded her approval. "Next one." Irma flipped the photo to the next one. It's a child, maybe 3 years old. He's bound up and submerged in water. I recognize several different steroids on the table next to him. Some we use to help attempt to restart the heart after cardiac arrest. "Good, next photo." And on the girl demanded until Irma had described each one of the horrible 32 photos in her hands. A litany of crimes against humanity. "And what do you think?" Irma knew what she thought, because it was a thought that had germinated throughout her first real hospital experience during the 2-week war 12 years ago. She remembered a horribly burned young soldier and a nurse happily musing that a recently developed treatment would likely help him greatly. It did. The results were nearly miraculous, with nearly fully restored use of a limb so badly damaged it would have normally been amputated. The scarring had not been as severe as expected. The treatment had been Jew medicine, the miracle of the Reich, the reason why it was the most medically advanced nation on Earth, decades ahead of the world. The use of Jews and others in medical experimentation was an open secret in the Reich, something the first generation born after the war had politely ignored. The second generation simply shrugged it off, and the third considered the situation to have been completely blown out of proportion. Sure, there were human trials, but the people involved knew what they were doing and were compensated accordingly. With the information ministry's iron grip on all media, the truth had been impossible to expose, despite numerous attempts to do so. All anybody had to show for the effort was personal testimony that state media laughed off before the individual was arrested for inciting unrest. Until today. The girl in the passenger seat didn't wait for Irma's answer. She could read it on her face. "We've got contacts all over. Scouted you out a while ago. Married, but barren or infertile. No children after years of trying. husband's career suffering for his failure to create more Aryan heirs for the Great Reich, and yours too. You should be a doctor, but there was never quite room for you in the advanced training programs, was there? You're unerwünscht, unwanted. It was a slang term used by the Germans to refer to individuals who were not seen as materially or culturally contributing to the Reich's greatness. It was one step above being an inferior race, and there were rumors that unerwünscht were eventually relocated to labor camps for the purity of the Reich. You want to actually do something with your life? Irma did. The next day, she returned to work, a smile on her face for the first time in months. Her marriage was still in shambles. A divorce would be the final nail in both their social coffins. She still hated her job and increasingly her role in society. But for the first time she could remember, she had a goal now. Andrews Air Force Base. Redacted. Dark Star on Overwatch. The voice over the speakers was coming via satellite feed from thousands of miles away, as was the video being projected onto a large white wall. It was grainy, low resolution, but undeniably a miracle of modern technology. For the first time in history, a U.S. president could sit courtside to an ongoing and highly secret military operation. It was all possible thanks to the extensive communications gear inside the classified basement office deep in the heart of Andrews Air Force Base. So far, the president was so impressed that he would immediately push for these capabilities to be moved directly to the White House. Even via Marine One, Andrews was too far away to handle emergencies. The assembled group of the president's senior-most cabinet members, as well as the communication staff cleared to run the place, had been watching the mission unfold via grainy thermal footage for the last hour or so. The vehicle delivering this feed via line-of-sight link to an orbiting communications plane and then satellite straight to Andrews was one of the Air Force's most secretive platforms, a stealthy, unmanned drone known as Dark Star. Drones were nothing new, and the F-117 and B-2 bomber had been introduced to the world years before, but nobody thought the technology could be miniaturized to this extent yet, or the drone's flying wing shape flyable with such a small body. And it wasn't. It was incredibly unstable. But advances in fly-by-wire technology and computers made the drone possible. As far as any German radar operators knew, there was nothing in their skies, save for an occasional very weak track that would be chalked down to equipment malfunction. Dark Star flew lazily over the mission site, a seemingly abandoned plantation just over the border from friendly Angola in Reich territory. 2 thermal birds, or satellites in intelligence speak, had overflown the site and confirmed activity anywhere between 8 and 14 individuals. Dark Star had a much lower resolution due to a smaller optics package, but allowed for persistent and real-time monitoring. The stealth drone had been over the target site for 3 hours before the SEAL team had reached the perimeter, confirming at least 12 individuals, not counting the hostages believed to be inside. The SEALs were clearly visible, making their break out of the tree line, moving in pairs from cover to cover. While the rest of the team provided overwatch, 2 SEALs moved up. At 3 different points along the perimeter, snipers had taken positions. The president wasn't privy to the SEALs' communications. Those would be local to avoid the possibility of radio intercepts, but the men appeared to be moving like a well-oiled machine. The president had no power over the men on the ground anymore. They would act on their own judgment. This was the investment the nation had made in them. All he could do was watch as the carefully planned ambush played out on the screen. The snipers were the first to open up, eliminating targets inside the main building where the drone couldn't see. Their rifles were silenced as best as possible, buying the SEALs a few moments of confusion before the general alarm was raised. But those seconds were all they needed. In brutal efficiency, 5 personnel outside the plantation were eliminated. Seemed like no more than a few seconds after that, the assault element had breached the plantation home. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The few minutes went by slowly, placing an incredible strain on the nerves of everyone assembled. Finally, a figure exited the home. With such low resolution, it was impossible to tell if it was friend or foe, but the figure activated an electronic beacon, which let off a steady pulse of infrared light for 30 seconds. This was how the SEALs communicated mission success to the drone loitering above. The room erupted into cheers and backclapping, but shortly after, the men's attention was drawn back to the screen. The drone had slewed its camera upwards to observe a road leading up to the plantation. Several vehicles were clearly visible speeding down the road. Slewing toward a second road on the other side, more vehicles were visible. They were distinctly civilian vehicles, not armored military ones, which was a slight relief even as the icy grip of terror gripped the assembled men. It was a trap. The president's men raced. The Reich had baited him expertly with the kidnapping, and to avoid being directly involved, had outsourced the attack to their Iron Eagle contacts. The Iron Eagle had been all too happy for the opportunity to kill Americans, especially a whole team of its most elite soldiers. Now, the Reich would not just get to embarrass the US internationally, but it had the ammo it needed to escalate tensions with America and its allies. Even after careful investigation by both sides, nobody really knew who or what had started the two-week war. Tensions were sky-high along the border areas between the Reich and the US and its allies. Any number of small incidents could suddenly escalate the conflict. Despite the destruction both sides had scored on the other, the conflict had ended before being in any way decisive, and luckily before it had escalated to something worse. But history would know exactly who was to blame for the next war: the American president. 16 SEALs and what appeared to be 4 hostages were making their way to the tree line, but they'd never reach it in time. And if they did, what appeared to be 9 vehicles full of Iron Eagle fighters would easily catch them. "Sir, I need orders." The Secretary of Defense had to shake the president back to the present. The president looked confused, dazed, so the secretary repeated himself. "Friendly Hawk needs orders, sir. We can engage, slow down the pursuers, maybe get our boys home alive, but I need orders now." Friendly Hawk was an F-117 flying Overwatch miles behind Dark Star. It was serving as a communications link for the drone, but its small weapons bay had also been loaded with ground attack munitions for exactly a worst-case scenario as this. The Germans wouldn't have a chance in hell of catching the stealth plane, but dropping live ordnance on their territory would only add fuel to the fire. But if he did nothing, the president had to decide. The video feed was delayed by 2.7 seconds, he reminded himself. "Fuck it, do it. Give him everything we got. Contact Joint Base Williams and have them put birds up in the air just in case." The SecDef didn't acknowledge. He was already issuing commands over his comlink. Thousands of miles away, the drone operator sitting in an air-conditioned trailer 100 miles over the friendly side of Angola border got to work. Dark Star's only downside was the high latency, which required the drone operator to be in the same geographic region. But in the future, the Air Force was sure they'd be able to fly whole fleets of drones from the comfort and safety of the mainland. Dark Star's targeting laser was visible on the thermal feed as it landed in the relative center of a group of armed men. The president could see them rushing, taking cover as the retreating SEALs unleashed a wall of covering fire. Somewhere a dozen miles away, the F-117's bomb bay briefly opened, ejecting a laser-guided ground attack munition. The canister's munition rocket motor burned for a few seconds, and then the weapon automatically deployed a small pair of wings. The seeker on the nose of the bomb sniffed out the Dark Star's laser, and 2 minutes later found it. While still 500 feet over its target, the munition burst open, scattering smaller submunitions over a wide area. Over the thermal feed, a series of small, bright flashes suddenly appeared, reminding the president of those cheap fireworks on a string that you'd throw in the ground and watch go off one by one. Only a few of the human figures at the target site remained moving, and Dark Star's operator was already lasing another target. The F-117 burped out a second munition, its bomb bays opening and closing, disrupting its stealth shape for a brief period, the only hint to Nazi radar operators that the aircraft was there. The US was unleashing 2 new technologies that would reshape combat forever: stealth and precision weapons. But the F-117 had an extremely limited weapon bay, and no matter how deadly precise each bomb was, the odds that at least some of the SEALs wouldn't be coming home were high. Later, when he was alone in bed, he'd allow himself to mourn the men he'd sent to their death. But for now, the president's mind was already at work on how to prevent an international political disaster. Washington, D.C., 2 days later. "Do you see this, folks? Are you paying attention to this?" Alabama Congressman Eric Johnson was in his element, in front of the cameras at the foot of the Capitol. It was the perfect backdrop. "Our failed president, a really bad failure, one of the worst, sent our brave men and women into combat to rescue hostages and got a bunch of them killed. Well, not women, no, women can't be SEALs yet, but we're looking into it. I know a lot of good, very brave women, and we're looking into it, folks." The reporters knew all about the failed raid that had resulted in the loss of 8 men and caused the worst international crisis since the 2-week war. But Johnson wasn't talking to them, he was talking through their cameras to an outraged nation, one whose anger he played like an expert pianist. Keep the message simple, obfuscate the truth, and always deflect. Never get pinned down to any solid answers. German intelligence had learned how to manipulate American mass media expertly during Johnson's brief but meteoric political career. "Germany's laughing at us, folks. We look ridiculous. And now our very bad president, honestly, he's one of the worst in the history of this great nation, is leading us straight to war. And we'll win that war because we have the best military in the world, but we don't want to fight that war. We will, if we have to, but we don't want to fight, folks. That'll be bad for a lot of people. A lot of good people on both sides will suffer." Congressman, is it true that you're considering running for president in the upcoming election? And if so, how would you handle this crisis? The plant for German intelligence had an easy time burrowing herself into the US media machine. TV producers weren't immune to the bribes of either cash or sex, and her entire fake career had all led to this exact moment, this exact question. A lot of people are talking, they're asking me, Mr. Johnson, would you please run for president? We need someone strong, Mr. Johnson. He replied, listen, this country is the worst, the weakest it's ever been, and it's all because of our no-good president. The Germans are laughing at us, the world is laughing at us. We have the best military and everyone's laughing at us. So I gotta do something, folks. People are asking me and I gotta do something. So yes, I will be running for president of this great nation in the 1988 election. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, 1992. The bearded man thumped his chest defiantly as he addressed the ever-growing crowd. He was dressed in the traditional garb of a teacher at madrasa, once used to refer to any general type of educational institution, but now more commonly used to refer to a fundamentalist type of Islamic school, which had seen a rapid increase in popularity over the last few decades. It was an old term from medieval Islam, and the teacher was an older man from a more medieval interpretation of the faith. For generations, the German occupiers have held Holy Land, exploited it for themselves, and driven the faithful out of it or enslaved them. They deserve only blood in return. Sabah was alarmed by the enthusiastic response from the crowd. He was young but wise enough to know the danger in the old man's rhetoric. Violence against the German occupiers in Palestine and Jordan was nothing new. For Sabah's entire life, there had been attacks by radicals and extremists against the Germans. More often than not, the attacks only succeeded in killing the faithful who still lived there, under the oppressive yoke of the Third Reich. But a new wave of anger had gripped the region and threatened to spill over into unchecked levels of violence never seen before. He may be young, but he couldn't be silent anymore. Teacher, my apologies, but please, your words are not good. You must stop." The man turned slowly to face Sabah, the crowd growing silent. He scowled when he spotted Sabah. "Who is this unbearded one to speak to me of enlightenment?" The man turned to the crowd. "This boy is the problem. Right here, before our very eyes. Look upon his unbearded face. He wears the garb of the faithful, but shears his face like a sheep for the Westerners." The crowd now began to look at Sabah questioningly, despite the fact that many of the men here wore short or no facial hair as well. Even the Saudi royal family had taken to wearing shorter facial hair in the style of the West, but the old man played the audience's emotions expertly. "He wears the clean face of a prostitute for his American masters who have polluted the faithful. They occupy Holy Land, and by invitation of the royal family itself." The crowd was growing in anger, but the old man had crossed the line. The police had started to find it more trouble than it was worth to disperse the growing number of fundamentalists increasingly taking to the streets and public squares, mostly because on more than one occasion, their intervention has resulted in a bombing of the local police station. Now they generally allowed the long-bearded men dressed in traditional garb to preach as they pleased, as long as it stopped short of open calls to violence. But attacking the royal family, even if just in a speech, was a hard red line. There were several whistles as police officers who had been warily eyeing the spectacle from a distance began to approach, the wooden batons already in hand. This wasn't the first time they'd had to disperse a similar crowd or arrest an overly zealous teacher, but each time the probability of violence had only increased. The approaching police did little to deter the old man, nor Sabah. "You do not preach the prophet's words. Peace be upon him. You preach poison, hate, and it's the faithful who will pay the price." Sabah's response prompted jeers from the crowd, which was increasingly beginning to surround him. There were a few pushes, and Sabah lost his footing, falling to the ground. The police were there shortly after, though, using their batons to beat back the frenzied mob. Through the melee, Sabah spotted the old mullah one more time before he was dragged away, a satisfied smile on his face. Outskirts of Espino, Venezuela, Captain Tomlin was pissed. It wasn't so much the incoming enemy fire that smacked into the trees around him, throwing up showers of painful splinters that dug into every bit of exposed flesh. It wasn't even the random mortar the rebels were managing to drop with slowly increasing precision. It was the Bradleys, who had apparently forgotten they were bulletproof and his men were not. Tomlin angrily stomped past his men, putting up heavy return fire into thickly wooded hills that the enemy was using as a base of fire to pin his assault force down. A corporal manning an M60 machine gun had to pause, then watch incredulously as the captain angrily marched in front of his position and then passed, apparently oblivious to the incoming fire. As Tomlin passed another soldier taking cover behind a thick tree, he stopped briefly to angrily berate the man. "Fundamental, soldier! You ain't doing Sam dick but wasting ammo." The young private nodded eagerly, then began to return fire again, this time with a proper cheek weld on his rifle. The captain continued his angry march, oblivious to the firefight raging all around the jungle forest. This was a peacekeeping operation, at least that's what had been described to him stateside before deployment. Sometime in between leaving Fort Benning, Georgia and arriving in Caracas, the peacekeeping had turned into a full-blown war. Fascist guerrillas equipped with German arms and financed directly by the Reich itself had been waging an ongoing campaign against the American-backed government for a decade and a half now. But somebody in intelligence had royally fucked up. The guerrilla movement had turned into an army seemingly overnight, and the peacekeeping operation into a war. The Marines guarding Caracas airport had to fight off a surprise attack just as Tomlin and his men were arriving. He did not care to ever repeat a combat landing ever again. In Tomlin's mind, there were two kinds of men in this world: those who had experienced a combat landing in a C-17 and those who hadn't. The Bradleys had taken up a three-vehicle spread formation in a relatively clear area where they could pound the hillside with their cannons and machine guns. With such thick cover, though, they were unlikely to hit a damn thing. Even the onboard thermals wouldn't see much in the infuriatingly humid heat of the South American jungle. Captain Tomlin could have used the radio, but some messages were best delivered in person. Moving to the rear of the vehicle, he pounded on the hatch through which the infantry would enter and exit the vehicle. There was no reply. With a sigh, the captain scrambled up the side of the Bradley to the top of the turret. The concussive blast of the Bushmaster was significant, but Tomlin was undeterred. He angrily pounded on the hatch at the top of the turret, and a few moments later the hatch opened to reveal a very confused lieutenant peering out from inside the broiling hot, infernally loud vehicle. "Son, can you tell me what in Sam Dick you think you're doing?" The lieutenant, platoon leader for the attached Bradleys, looked incredulous. Sir, we're engaging the..." "Boy, if you don't get those god-dang vehicles moving up that hill, I'm gonna shove my boot so far up your ass you'll be coughing up shoelaces." "Sir, the terrain is difficult, the thick brush." Tomlin leaned in close, eyes narrowed. He ignored the metallic pinging of automatic rounds landing on the Bradley's armor. "Lieutenant, do you believe in your heart that America is the greatest nation the good Lord has ever placed on the face of the earth?" Sir, yes, "Then why, in Uncle Sam's red, white, and blue balls, have you so little faith in her engineers that they couldn't design a combat vehicle more powerful than thick brush?" The lieutenant stared up at the furious captain, mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. "Lieutenant, get these god-dang vehicles up that hill so my men can follow and I can get the hell back to civilization and a shower at some point in this lifetime." Tomlin didn't wait for an answer. He slammed the hatch shut and hopped down. Now that he dealt with the Bradley section, he had to make sure his platoon leaders were prepared for the assault. The sooner they took that hill and democratized every single fascist on it, the sooner this war would end, and he might get back to a nice, cold shower. White House Rose Garden. "Mr. President, are you prepared to label the situation in Venezuela a war?" President Eric Johnson nodded grimly. "The Venezuelans are facing certain difficulties, but this is still their thing, their problem. We're just there to support them, folks." President Johnson had honed his everyman signature style through the years of his meteoric rise in American politics, from a literal nobody to a congressman, then the leap to president and a stunning climb through his party's ranks. It's not that his party particularly liked him, the people did. He knew how to speak to them, and he said the things they wanted to hear. Unlike other politicians who carefully crafted their messages, Johnson simply spoke from the cuff, and nearly overnight he'd opened the floodgates to a rising tide of American political extremism. President Johnson nodded at another reporter, signaling her to ask her question. "Mr. President, how do you account for the fact that your foreign policy has, to date, nearly perfectly aligned with the goals and ambitions of the Third Reich?" Despite himself, Johnson was briefly taken aback. "As you prepare for re-election, do you really feel that you've best represented American foreign interests during your term, Mr. President?" Johnson, however, was always quick to recover. "Listen, we gotta cooperate, okay? Cooperation is good. I like cooperation. War? Not so good, folks. We saw that in the 2 Weeks War, a very bad war, okay? Mr. President, that doesn't explain years of indications you've placed American interests second to German interests. How do you explain the situation in Venezuela? How could the Reich have trained, equipped, and armed an entire army right in America's backyard?" The room went silent briefly. Even the reporters from the more nationalistic outlets, which had all ridden a wave of popularity created by Johnson's bombastic political personality, paused their note-taking. Johnson squinted at the reporter. He'd stressed to his staff the need to carefully screen press. It wasn't exactly proper protocol for presidential briefings, but it wasn't illegal either. And Johnson's presidency had thrived in the gray area between legal and not. What parts of the law even applied to a sitting president? Nobody knew, but the nation had 4 years to ask itself and still had not settled on an answer. He tried to remember the woman's face. He'd have his staff find some reason to pull her credentials in the future. Nobody's talking about an army, okay? You're talking about an army. Nobody here is talking about an army. It's an insurgency. It's been going on for years, okay? We got troops, very good troops, folks, the best. And they're peacekeeping, but nobody's talking about an army. Only you're talking about an army. The Venezuelan people, they're good people. We're going to help them out. It was a complete non-answer, but Johnson knew that didn't matter. It was easy to silence the stubborn reporters' requests for elaboration by simply calling on a much friendlier news outlet. But despite his signature grin, Johnson was worried enough to have doubts about pushing his luck with the second term. There had already been significant legal challenges, not just of his administration, and even investigations into his personal business in the past. It had taken all the political capital he had just to keep the Justice Department off his back, labeling the entire thing a political hit job. The narrative had worked thanks to Johnson's popular appeal. A second term would be a true coup, but in truth he had already succeeded. In the wake of his bombastic populist campaigning and policies, political extremism had exploded across the American landscape. Pro-Reich parties like the America United Party had used the opportunities Johnson created to claw their way into political legitimacy. American democracy, where everyone had a voice, had been all too easy to manipulate to ensure that now Germany too had a voice. Berlin, Germany. Irma couldn't have known she was waiting directly across the street from the same small ice cream stand in the same public plaza where decades ago Dr. Werner von Braun had defected from the Third Reich. The small ice cream stand was still there, a little worse for wear but in surprisingly good upkeep. Everything in the Third Reich was shiny and neat and orderly on the outside. A steel gray Volkswagen Jetta pulled up in front of her. She recognized the driver, who smiled at her warmly right away. They'd only seen each other perhaps a half a dozen times since Irma had been recruited just over 5 years ago, but the petite girl smiled at her warmly as if they were old friends, ushering her into the car. No, not girl, woman. She was in her mid-30s, which had shocked Irma when she'd found out. She'd been dead sure the American CIA agent had only been 20 at best. Maybe that's what had helped her avoid detection all these years, operating in the beating heart of the Third Reich. Irma sat in the passenger seat as the car joined the flow of traffic. "Have your papers for the checkpoint?" Irma nodded grimly. "Smile more. Look happy to see me. You never know who's watching." Irma did, and the two briefly chatted about nothing in particular, as if they were two friends meeting up for dinner plans. Irma had been amazed at the level of penetration the American spies had achieved in the Reich, but exposure to their world quickly revealed it'd been no great feat at all. Every single one of the American agents she made contact with over the last 5 years looked like they had been cut out of a mold. Young-looking, blonde, attractive. She'd seen them in action and realized how vulnerable the Reich truly was to spying. In a nation built on nationalist fervor, all it took to gain favors was to say the right things. Looking the part of Aryan perfection didn't hurt matters either. No second thoughts? No. Irma continued smiling, but her voice was lifeless. Her life in the Reich hadn't been what she planned, what she'd been promised as a child by years of propaganda that it would be. She was a good Aryan woman, pretty, smart, she loved her nation. Or she did once. But none of it mattered. She couldn't conceive, no matter how many times her and her husband tried, or how many treatments they pursued. She'd even suggested that he might get himself checked out. But the idea that it was him who was infertile was out of the question. And so she produced no good, strong German children to continue the Reich's 1,000-year reign. Her husband grew ever more distant, the couple increasingly ostracized socially and in their careers. He was now stuck in a dead-end office job with the military. She'd been passed over from medical school despite her intelligence and talent. She was unerwünscht. The Reich had little room for you if you didn't directly contribute to the future of the German race. But even those insults to her dignity, the broken promises of propaganda, hadn't been what had turned her into a traitor. It had been something worse. Judemedizin, or Jew medicine. The Reich's medical knowledge was decades ahead of the world, even America, and to her horror she discovered the quiet secret that so many were in on, but never publicly acknowledged. The truth had revolted her. and she'd chosen to fight back against the system that had discarded her and inflicted such horrible evils on others. When will the news break? Irma didn't know if the spy would answer her question, but was surprised when she did. In the spy game, information was a monopoly, and you were given only what you needed to immediately know. It'll be breaking while you're in the air. By the time you land, the world will know. The car slowed as it came to a red light. The American spy looked at Irma for a long moment. You understand, you can never talk about what you did. Not if you want to stay alive, that is. Irma nodded. She was fine with that. She didn't care to claim any credit for what was to come. Truth be told, she was torn in two inside. Glad to have played her part in infiltrating the Reich's experimental medical program, and horrified at the things she'd been forced to do to others to maintain her cover. 5 years of gathering evidence. 5 years that slowly ate away at her soul. If she wasn't truly barren, she felt incapable of hosting life now. She imagined any seed that took hold inside her would surely rot and fester. The Jetta approached the checkpoint near the airport and pulled into the special lane for VIPs, a perk of Irma's position at the Institute for Advanced Medical Research. The guard who inspected her paperwork thanked her profusely upon seeing the special stamp on her identification card, naming her as research staff. "Ma'am, my brother owed his life to your work. I can't thank you enough. When you return from your travels, please look my family up. We are Richters of Charlottenburg. My father is a very well-placed man, and my mother will insist on making you a meal." Irma nodded and smiled politely, assuring the young guard he couldn't have been older than 19 that she would indeed. A German life saved, a countryman. A Nazi life saved, a monster. The boy thanked her profusely several more times before the American spy pulled away. Minutes later, they arrived at the terminal for outgoing flights. The American pulled out a pair of tickets along with a printout. "Your itinerary." Irma thanked her and accepted them, stepping out of the vehicle and retrieving a small backpack from the back seat that had been prepared for her. She hadn't been allowed to return home to pick up any of her belongings, none of her own clothes, her keepsakes, her dead mother's jewelry, nothing. It all had to stay. The risk was too great. She hadn't even said goodbye to her husband, which was fine really, as the two barely talked anymore. Divorce would have been their ultimate social suicide. When German intelligence put the pieces together, though, she wondered what would happen to him. Nothing good, she thought. That made her feel a twinge of regret, guilt. "Goodbye, Irma. You've done a good thing, a heroic thing. One day, maybe they'll say it was you." Irma didn't respond, merely nodded and closed the door. Turning on her heel and throwing the backpack over her shoulder, she entered the busy International Departures Terminal. CNN Studios headquarters, Atlanta, Georgia. This was the type of week that a major cable news anchor lives for, tragedy aside. It was the type of week that made careers, legends of broadcasting. It was the type of week that had forged men like Walter Cronkite, the newsman who had shepherded America through the failed US-backed Soviet insurgency, the 2-week war, and any number of proxy conflicts in Africa and Asia between the United States and the Third Reich. But Bob felt sick to his stomach. The glaring studio lights seemed brighter than usual today. The countdown until they were live began to tick down from 10. In his earpiece, he received last-minute instructions from the control room. All across America and nations carrying American broadcast channels, currently scheduled programming was interrupted. CNN would break the story, other carriers would quickly pick it up. The source material was already being shared globally, thanks to the wonders of modern electronic communications. Bob was live to the world. "Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt your regularly scheduled broadcast for a breaking news story out of Germany. I must warn you, if you have children nearby, you should consider asking them to leave the room until the end of this bulletin. What follows will include graphic photographic images and video." Bob paused for a moment. He'd seen the material an hour before. He didn't cherish going over it once more, this time with an audience of millions. "For far too long, we've heard rumors of the atrocities committed by the Third Reich long after the alleged end of their cultural enrichment programs in 1957. For far too long, we have been complicit as a nation, as a world, in keeping the open secret of the continued horrors that take place behind the walls of Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. But that secret cannot be kept anymore, thanks to images and video provided to this network by a brave German defector, whose name sadly we'll never likely know. Ladies and gentlemen, what follows are graphic images and footage, all taken in secret, from the Reich's Advanced Medical Research Laboratories. I must warn you again, please ask any minors to leave the room." White House Oval Office, Washington, D.C. "How the hell was the President of the United States not briefed on this program? This is an insurrection. You have waged an insurrection against the presidency." Eric Johnson was livid. The resolute desk had borne his wrath and showed signs of multiple impacts from heavy objects. It would take specialists to restore the antique gifted to President Rutherford B. Hayes by Queen Victoria in 1880. CIA Director Lucas Burns bore the president's wrath unflinchingly. He was a career intelligence man. This did not even rank in the top 30 most dangerous situations he'd ever been in. Politically dangerous perhaps, but Burns had taken the same pledge as every director before him to execute his duty faithfully to the American people and absent of political consideration. Mr. President, Project Bluebird was authorized by sealed executive order by President Kennedy in 1967. Knowledge of its existence was deemed need to know. Under terms authorized and reviewed by President Kennedy, the House Judiciary, and even the Supreme Court, all conducted in secret, of course, Project Bluebird was greenlit to be carried through to completion when goals were judged to be satisfactorily met. Those goals were met, Mr. President. "This is a goddamn insurrection. I'll throw you in jail, you son of a bitch." President Johnson was practically frothing at the mouth and already on the phone requesting to be put through to the FBI. Burns had expected this. The constitutionality of Project Bluebird had always bothered Burns, as it had bothered every director before him. But ultimately, Kennedy had feared German influence over American politics and deemed the risk of subverting presidential power in such an outrageous way necessary. The Supreme Court and House Judiciary had unanimously agreed. He'd already prepared his resignation letter. The president and his supporters in Congress, there were far too many of them, Burns thought disgustedly, would be out for blood. And he would be the sacrificial lamb that they would tear to pieces. He was protected legally. Johnson's insipid influence hadn't yet penetrated the entirety of the American judiciary system, and today's Supreme Court would have an uphill battle overturning a decision by the 1967 court, though not an impossible one. The whole affair had flirted dangerously with outright subversion in the very spirit of American democracy, and set a horrible precedent. Burns was glad it was all over, and prepared to pay the price if it came to it. He allowed himself one small smile, though. Johnson would not be running for re-election. Of that, he was certain. Undisclosed location, German Republic, 2007. "The Americans are distracted. Now would be a prudent time to strike." The statement elicited a round of murmurs from the men gathered around the long conference table. None wore uniforms, insignia, or any mark of station. As a show of solidarity, it had become the group's tradition to strip themselves of any sign of status or political power at each meeting. But all knew the political worth of their peers, and some members of this meeting would have been recognizable to any member of the public. The defense minister, for example, or the secretary of labor. Other faces were less well known. Senior intelligence officials, titans of industry who did their best to remain out of the limelight, wealthy aristocrats whose families still wielded significant political power. To some, this was a meeting of traitors. To others, patriots of the highest order. The defense minister shook his head gravely. "They still wield considerable conventional power despite their commitments to Venezuela and Afghanistan, and any hostilities with America will trigger an Article 5 response from SEATO." The Americans and many in the Saudi elite had hoped that decades of cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia would have acclimated the worst of the fundamentalists to the presence of U.S. troops in the Holy Land. They were there by invitation, a shield to further German expansion in the Middle East. But the fundamentalists painted all the Westerners with the same brush and saw little difference between Germany's occupation of Palestine, Jordan, and more, and the American presence in Saudi Arabia. They blamed the Americans for the liberal values that had taken root in the once fundamentalist nation, a cancer on Muslim purity. They had made their voices known on September 11, 2001, when 2 aircraft struck the World Trade Center in New York. Another hit the Pentagon, but the 4th had been brought down by the passengers who'd heroically sacrificed themselves to avoid further tragedy. The American response had been surprising, not just to the terror network that had launched the attack from the safety of a fundamentalist-controlled Afghanistan, but to the Germans. Within 2 months, the U.S. had put boots on the ground. In less than a month, the same fundamentalist regime the Germans had financially backed in the 70s to overthrow the liberal American-backed one had been driven from power. But now an insurgency raged in no small part due to Germany seizing the opportunity to funnel hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks in equipment and supplies to the ousted regime. It had diverted resources from the still raging insurgency in Venezuela, which also kept the Americans tied up, but the investment was worth it. The real problem was challenging America conventionally as long as it had the full backing of its Southeast Asia Treaty Organization allies, China, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and more. Then we must work to weaken SEATO from within. What we need is another Johnson. The man who spoke this time was a steel tycoon. His company oversaw 44% of the Reich's steel production, with labor camps set up across the former Soviet Union, pumping out some of the finest quality steel in the entire world. A senior German intelligence official shook his head vehemently. American politics may be open to anyone with the resources to influence them, but the Johnson affair blew up in our faces thanks to those medical research leaks. The leaking of photos and videos from the Reich's advanced medical research laboratories had resulted in massive social and political backlash against the Reich. Well known to be a xenophobic state, the world largely turned a blind eye to the way it treated people in occupied territories. It had even gladly kept the open secret about the Reich's cultural advancement programs, which were little more than forced labor camps or extermination camps for those deemed not strong enough to work. But having photo and video evidence shoved into its face over TV broadcasts had forced the world to finally act. Germany was never more isolated internationally, and this was but one of many of its problems. The intelligence official shook his head again. No, the Americans are too anti-German to fall for another Johnson so soon. Anything we do will just polarize them even further against us. What we must actually do is look inwardly, not outwardly. The table grew silent. Some knew what he was about to say. And even here, in a meeting that were it to be discovered, most if not all the men who were here would be imprisoned or worse. They were dangerous words. For decades, our foolish pursuit of racial purity has done nothing but drive birth rates down, wiped out entire labor pools, and driven the best and brightest straight into the arms of the Americans. For all the talk of their mongrel society, they have outdone us in nearly every area of competition. Our stupid insistence on ignoring their accomplishments has placed the Reich in the gravest danger it has ever been. The Americans don't need to fire a single shot to destroy us. They need only wait and continue to overtake us in scientific achievement, economy, even culture. It is the purity of our people that has united Europe, creating the greatest power the continent has ever known. The Secretary of Labor banged his fist against the table angrily. And while you were taking Europe, the Americans took the world. The intelligence official's remark stunned the assembled group. Even as deeply indoctrinated as they were, it was a difficult point to contest. Birth rates were down, at their lowest point in the Reich's history, and social advancement programs had failed to yield the hundreds of millions of pure-blooded Aryan citizens the Reich desperately needed to continue competing with America and its allies. The English and French-occupied territories had been even granted a degree of anonymity. Germany simply couldn't shoulder the cost of continuing to administer the entirety of the Reich on its own any longer. If the assembled men had paid more attention to history, they would have seen the writing on the wall. If they had better resisted the years of propaganda indoctrination that they'd all grown up with, they may have listened to the intelligence official. Instead, the only group with the collective political, economic, and military capital to challenge the Chancellor and change Germany's direction would not, and the intelligence official would be dead within the week. WWII, occupied Soviet territory. The traffic at the border control point was more intense than usual. Finding itself unable to fully exploit the natural resources of the former Soviet territories on its own, the Reich had at last opened up investment to foreign powers. Given that this was about as far east as one could go in the Soviet territories and thousands of kilometers from Berlin, the move to allow foreign investment hadn't been nearly as controversial. But for Obergefreiter Hans Bauer, that meant pulling border duty and inspecting the vehicles of thousands of Chinese and other mongrel races, most of which worked at the newly opened oil fields and mines, or simply delivered critically needed supplies. The Reich was experiencing a manpower crisis, too much territory, too few people, and was increasingly at risk of losing its grip on its post-World War II holdings. But that didn't mean Hans had to like what was happening one single bit. He snarled out a guttural stop when the next driver pulling up to his checkpoint failed to stop exactly at the red paint markings indicating where the front wheels should rest. He'd been taught some basic Chinese, despite the fact that the people coming through this checkpoint were as much Chinese as not, but he refused to use it. If these dogs wanted to profit off the Reich, then they better learn German. The driver was clearly not Chinese, or at least not full-blooded. There were hints of Arab by the look of it, but who could tell with all the race mixing that went on in those uncivilized parts of the world? The only thing he'd been taught about Arabs was to never let one touch you. They wiped themselves with their hands, he'd been told. Disgusting. But what was to be expected? Hans barked out a command for the driver's documents. The driver appeared nervous, but Hans was impatient and frankly too bored to pay much attention. He never noticed the small snub-nosed pistol that appeared in the open windshield and put a 9mm round straight through his brain. In the passenger seat, the man accompanying the driver brandished an M16 and opened fire on the other guard assisting with the inspection. The American-made rifles were widely available thanks to decades of having been provided by the US government to guerrilla fighters across Asia and Africa combating the Reich. It had quickly become a symbol of anti-Reich resistance, and it was an effective one, reliable and accurate. What it lacked in stopping power, it made up for in ruggedness and precision. The 5.56 rounds with steel penetrator cores punched straight through the soldier's body armor, and seconds later the driver was gunning the engine as hard as he could. The truck lurched forward and ran over the spike strips that would normally be removed by the soldiers shortly before the truck was allowed entry. The metal of the wheels screamed as the vehicle ran on rims, but it didn't need to go much further. Just a quarter of a kilometer ahead, the traffic had come to a logjam again as the intake lanes narrowed to a regular highway. Other border guards opened fire on the runaway vehicle, strafing it with rifle and machine gun fire, but they couldn't stop 3 tons of runaway truck, and shortly before the wheels completely disintegrated, the vehicle smashed straight into the back of a van waiting at the rear end of the traffic logjam. A moment later, the several thousand pounds of explosives in the back of the truck exploded, but not before atomizing 200 pounds of low-grade uranium. The explosion created a 10-meter crater, destroyed 3 dozen vehicles, and killed 45 people, 5 of them being German. But the molecular uranium was spread over hundreds of meters, irradiating the entire border checkpoint and much of the land around it. Even with months of cleanup efforts, the site would remain unusable for years, effectively choking off a vital trade artery into the Soviet territories. Simultaneous attacks across the Chinese-German border contaminated other major trade arteries. The badly needed trade corridors would end up shuttering many operations in the Russian Far East, causing significant economic harm to the Reich and spoiling its opportunity to exploit its lucrative gas, petroleum, and mineral deposits that marked the territory. Hong Kong, China. Sun Ning waited patiently for the German ambassador, ordering a second appetizer. She'd already finished the first 15 minutes ago and had arrived famished. She hadn't had much of a chance to eat due to the hectic nature of her work in the wake of the border terrorist attacks. The ambassador was either having similar issues, and she had no reason to doubt he wasn't, or his tardiness was to make a point. Selma Krauss finally arrived, escorted by waitstaff to the private dining table toward the rear of the restaurant. The 2 women cordially greeted each other, Sun making a mental note of the way the ambassador had defaulted to German. Normally, it was common courtesy to utilize the tongue of the nation a diplomat was being hosted in. Like so many other things in the grand game of international diplomacy, this small detail was neither an accident nor insignificant. At least it gave Sun a portent of how this conversation may go. "I hope this evening finds you well, Miss Ning. I apologize for my tardiness." Krauss hadn't offered a reason for her lateness, another neither accidental nor insignificant detail. "Not at all, Miss Krauss. It afforded me a brief calm amidst my chaotic day." The 2 women smiled politely at each other. The diplomatic sparring had already begun. But the act was one of habit by both attendees, because this dinner, like so many others before it, was not about traditional diplomacy. The women, both powerful representatives of their respective governments, had found it convenient long ago to hold informal discussions where they could speak more freely with one another. It had been a mutually beneficial arrangement that had likely averted numerous international misunderstandings between the German superpower and a China that was increasingly finding its own footing on the international stage. A waiter arrived and took the women's orders, then retreated. The table was far enough away from the common dining area that the ambient noise and the restaurant's music effectively drowned out their conversation. Krauss didn't believe for a moment that the Chinese hadn't planted multiple bugs on the table and in the vicinity, but what she discussed here was never secret. "Your government has made a grave mistake, one whose consequences it may soon discover is ill-prepared to bear." Sun was unfazed. She was a woman in a senior leadership position in a Chinese nation deeply rooted in Han chauvinism. It would take more than threats of war to get a rise out of her. "I believe it is you who's made the mistake. We know that you have analyzed the uranium debris and that the isotope ratio indicates it comes from the Congo." Krauss did flinch ever so slightly. How the Chinese, an inferior race, had managed to penetrate so deeply into German intelligence was a matter of national concern. Only Reich citizens could serve in the German military, government, or intelligence apparatus, so a Chinese plant was practically impossible. Perhaps their ability to eavesdrop electronically was significantly more advanced than they had suspected, however. Or perhaps the Americans were lending their aid. Since evicting the communists to Taiwan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and the Democratic Government of China had been close allies. Both thoughts were equally alarming. The attacks were launched from your territory. My superiors are finding it increasingly difficult to believe the Chinese government was in no way involved. The Americans were equally incredulous that a group operating out of the caves in Afghanistan could bring down the World Trade Center and seriously damage the Pentagon. Hijacking and crashing a couple of airplanes into a building is one thing. Transporting hundreds of kilos of even low-grade uranium across China is another altogether. And as I said, my superiors are finding it increasingly difficult to believe you were not involved in any way. The two paused their conversation long before the waiter bringing their drinks was within earshot, an old habit of career diplomats. Only once the ambience drowned out their words once more did they resume their verbal sparring match. You would do well, Mrs. Krause, to remind your superiors that the Himalayas stand tall, and moving troops into the Russian Far East is expensive and risky. China is not impressed by military threats against it. In case you've forgotten, CETO is treaty-bound to respond to any military attack against it. Krause took a long drink of her sparkling water before responding. She never drank wine, not even at home. The American-made bugs the Chinese agents had planted there confirmed it. I wouldn't underestimate the Wehrmacht, Miss Ning. I would also not be so confident about the American people's willingness to defend China thousands of miles from their own shores. Sun sipped her own drink. The Himalayas were an effective barrier between China and the German Indian Territory. It was still largely administered by the British, who enjoyed a small amount of autonomy within the Reich. But unlike in other territories, the Germans hadn't enacted their cultural enhancement programs. Perhaps it was too far from their own home, or perhaps it was simply too difficult to murder 1 billion people quietly. Either way, rather than extermination or enslavement, the Indians had actually been left much in the same state as when they were ruled by colonial Britain. Even so, Nazi Germany had more than enough Indian troops in the uniform of the Reich to pose a serious challenge to China, if the Himalayas could be overcome, or if America simply stayed home. And that point did scare Sun, because despite their treaty commitments, the Americans had a strong isolationist streak in them. It had been their isolationism that allowed Britain to fall, entering the European theater far too late to stop the complete occupation of Europe by the Reich. They had only opted to enter the European War at all when it became clear the Nazis were on the verge of taking the entirety of the Middle East, and thus gaining a stranglehold on global oil exports. With the two increasingly unpopular wars quickly turning into asymmetric quagmires and deeply polarized politics, the American commitment to Article 5 was increasingly in question. University of Michigan. The American people need to seriously ask themselves, how much and how many? Parts of the crowd murmured its approval. The rest remained silent. It was a far cry from the fiery rallies of President Johnson in the late 80s and early 90s, but since news of the Nazi medical experimentation on Jews, the mentally challenged and other undesirables had broken, the American people had cooled significantly on anyone seen as pro-Reich. The America United movement had faltered considerably, but it hadn't gone extinct. Johnson's failure to secure a second term, combined with allegations of collaboration with the Nazis, which remained unproven, had been a death knell for the movement. But like a slumbering beast, it hadn't truly died, simply gone into hibernation until enough time had passed for the collective consciousness to forget. Americans were, after all, the most emotional of all democracies, and emotions, when properly stoked, could burn hotter than any rational thought. The speaker, young, handsome, probably only a few years out of college, was in the final closing remarks of the small rally. He was charismatic, impassioned, and despite the lukewarm reaction of the crowd, more were clapping now than when he had begun speaking. The United States spends billions on bases overseas, shoring up weak allies who are not pulling their fair share. And all this at a time when it's involved in 2 wars. America's at the breaking point, friends. She cannot take much more of this. Let China, Japan, Australia, let CETO stand on its own, without us having to babysit it, without these countries exploiting us. They're not paying their fair share, and we all know it. Now they want us to fight their wars for them too. More of the crowd began to nod and clap in approval. Friends, we need to be a country of peace, not war, especially not one that wages other people's wars. People who don't even contribute their fair share to this alliance. We need to send a message to Washington, to the entire establishment. We're not writing checks for the rest of the world anymore. We need to take care of our veterans, our retirees, our own people in infrastructure are all falling apart because Washington sends all your tax dollars overseas. America needs to stand united, and it needs to place America first. There was a small outburst of applause, not the thunderous roar that Johnson's rallies once elicited, but a small, promising start nonetheless. Afghanistan. Son, can you explain to me why in Sam Dick I'm still taking fire from that building? Lieutenant Colonel Tomlin leaned down next to the corporal taking cover behind the brick wall, so he could better be heard over the raging firefight. The small city in East Afghanistan had been cleared of enemy fighters for years, but a massive influx of German-made arms had made its way to the northern Pakistani tribal areas, where the beaten insurgency had been licking its wounds. The insurgency, near the brink of collapse, had been rejuvenated with a vigor that took the U.S. by surprise. Now it was having to retake old territory against an enemy armed with frighteningly modern weapons. The young corporal winced every time rounds cracked the stone nearby. For Tomlin, they were just another annoyance, but not as great as the fact that he shouldn't have been taking any fire, because the enemy's base, a 3-story house, should have been either cleared or leveled by now. At this point, Tomlin would have settled for leveled. The lieutenant colonel pointed at the rocket launcher on the soldier's back. "You've got an Army-issue M141 bunker defeat munition strapped to your back, boy. Why in a bald eagle's nutsack have you not employed the weapon the American taxpayer has been gracious enough to equip you with?" The corporal winced again as more rounds cracked the thick concrete cinder blocks that he and his squad were taking cover behind. The lieutenant colonel seemed oblivious to the incoming fire, only hunching down behind the cover so he could be heard over the racket. "Sir, we've witnessed several possible civilians in that building. Corporal, every civilian death is a goddamn tragedy, and a stain on those whose profession is the honorable pursuit of warfare. But how much longer you reckon this brick wall is going to hold under fire?" "Not long," was the proper answer, evidenced by the slowly disintegrating bricks they were taking cover behind. The corporal thought for a moment, then nodded. Turning to his squad, he flipped the rocket off his back. "I'm popping that house, give me cover!" The squad saw gunner lifted his weapon up over the concrete parapet and began to open up on the building, providing cover fire alongside several other riflemen. The corporal quickly prepared the rocket, then picked himself up onto a knee and brought the weapon to bear. The lieutenant colonel, now standing fully up and watching the building expectantly, looked down to offer a final piece of instruction. "Don't forget to check your back blast, son." With a significant pop and a hiss, the rocket ejected from the barrel and began to roar toward its target. Tomlin shoved the soldier's head down behind cover as he remained standing and watched the target's house. "Head down, boy! You don't want to get it knocked off by debris." At only about 100 or so meters away, the flash and the roar of the explosion were simultaneous. The M141 was designed to take out fortified enemy bunkers. The 3-story civilian house didn't stand a chance. Anyone who survived the initial explosion, an unlikely proposition, was buried under tons of rubble. The fight over this stretch of 4 blocks died down soon after. The job of clearing the neighborhood was a dirty one, door-to-door fighting in close quarters. But Tomlin's men were well trained and all extremely experienced after 6 years of fighting. He should have been a colonel by now, but Tomlin had refused to test for promotion. His rank already demanded too much non-combat time from him. If he got the big birds on his shoulders, he'd likely get pulled out of it completely. That was unacceptable. The Army had threatened to retire him if he continued to decline testing, and Tomlin had immediately offered his resignation. His superiors had quickly retracted that threat. As the sun began to set, he came across the same corporal poking through the remains of the building he'd been responsible for demolishing. The young man noticed Tomlin and acknowledged him with a grim nod. "Colonel, they found bodies, civilians in the rubble, 3 of them." Tomlin sighed, removing his helmet for the first time since the fighting had started that morning. He was soaked in sweat, and salt had crusted along the nape of his neck, irritating his skin and wearing it raw as his body armor shifted with every step he took. "Corporal, one day when you get back home, you'll hear the bleeding hearts going on and on about civilian casualties. But you didn't come here to kill civilians, and those civilians didn't choose this either. The enemy made that choice for them, and sure, maybe you could have taken the building without losing any of your squad, or maybe it would have taken 1 or 2 of you to get here. Not a bad exchange for 3 civilians, if we're being honest, but maybe it would have taken your entire squad." Tomlin placed his helmet down on the ground and sat on it, undoing his bootlaces so his feet could breathe a little. "Point is, you don't know how many of your buddies' lives it would have taken. So you made the choice you did. And those bleeding hearts back home, they weren't here to make that choice either." Lieutenant Colonel Tomlin squinted up at the setting sun, the sounds of battle having moved significantly ahead of his position. It wasn't so much that he liked being in combat. It was that this was where he was needed the most. Großdeutscher Reichstag, Berlin, 2014. The lights in the secure compartmentalized facility were low, adding a conspiratorial air to the meeting. Amongst the assembled in the room were the most powerful members of the German parliament. The chancellor himself was notably absent. One wall was almost entirely occupied by video displays, which were all currently showing muted news broadcasts from the various state-approved networks. All of them were covering the same stories: continued riots in German-administered Britain. Granting them any semblance of autonomy was a mistake. Like a cancer, our weakness has spread from France to Britain and who knows where next." The speaker was a heavy-set man, not particularly liked by his peers, but Vreni Walter had strong ties to the military, which made him an important part of this unofficial committee. Helma Schneider tried her best not to curl her nose as she addressed the rotund legislator. She was seated close to him and could smell the unwashed stink of the man. How his wife or his many mistresses tolerated his physical advances were beyond her, but she tried to push her personal distaste away for the sake of progress. "The British problem is only a symptom of a deeply rooted illness within the Reich itself. Years ago, I was at one of this group's first meetings, and we were warned back then of what was coming. The man who delivered that warning was summarily shot not 4 days later. I hope that the gravity of this situation we're now facing will sober and ground our attitudes on criticism moving forward. Gentlemen, the Reich is dying." Years ago, such a statement would have been received with shock by those assembled, and anyone who dared utter such a sentiment was taking their lives into their own hands. But the ongoing British riots had been a sobering wake-up call to many within the highest levels of German government. The writing was on the wall. It had been for decades. "I do not disagree completely with our father's vision for Germany, but we must face cold, hard facts. The quest for German purity has failed. Birth rates are at their lowest levels since the establishment of the Reich. Entire suburbs across Germany are becoming ghost towns. The Reich's scientific achievement simply cannot keep pace with the United States and its allies. Our industry stagnates. Our culture wanes. Our international friends are few." Rupert Feld, a legislator with ties to the Reich's propaganda department, shook his head vigorously. "These are temporary problems. We simply need to rethink the way we implement our cultural program. No, Mr. Feld, these are systemic problems, and it's time we face the truth." Helma made it a point to hold the man's gaze until he shrunk from her stare. Around the room, others avoided her eyes as well. "We have believed our own lies for too long." Uwe Schmidt was, in Helma's opinion, one of the most level-headed legislators in the room. He had grown up in occupied India, far from the Reich's center of power, and thus had been largely immune to its propaganda. This gave him a grounded perspective Helma had grown to appreciate, and the two had become fast allies. "Afghanistan and Venezuela continue to drain American resources. Our influence operations within America have stoked the discontent of war weariness. We have bought ourselves some room to maneuver. If we're to take drastic action, then the time for such an opportunity is running short." The room went quiet. It was Helma who broke the silence. "We all know the Chancellor will not take necessary actions. There are certain members of the Parliament who will likewise be unhelpful if we're to right what's been set wrong. Mr. Schmidt and I have created a list of those we believe will be supportive and those we believe will be problematic." Uwe reached into his briefcase and carefully entered a combination into the digital lock. Inside, he removed 13 manila folders, one each for the members of the unofficial committee. In the final printout are individuals who will have to be removed from their positions. Their views will not align with ours at all. The men were silent for a minute as they reviewed the lists inside the respective folders. Many nodded in agreement. The group was of a like mind, but there remained one question. It was Vreni Walter who asked it. "And what about the Chancellor?" Uwe was prepared. "He'll face trial for crimes against the Reich for allowing its decline. We have evidence prepared and judges ready. The trial will be quick, naturally, to avoid giving the public time to react. Within 48 hours, he'll be found guilty and officially stripped of power. For his apprehension, though, we'll need the cooperation of the military, Mr. Walter." Walter nodded slowly. The normally cocksure man was unusually silent, his mind making careful calculations. The gravity of what was being proposed weighed heavily on all assembled. Up until this point, every member of the committee, save for Schmidt and Schneider, could claim some level of innocent ignorance. When Walter spoke next, he spoke very carefully. "Yes, I believe we could succeed at all goals presented." The pressure in the room increased. Now there was no denial for anyone involved. If they were discovered, there would be no chance of pleading innocence. However, there's still the matter of the Chancellery itself. Uwe nodded, knowingly. "I believe we can all agree there's only one natural fit for the position. Mrs. Schneider is well liked by the people and trusted by them. They'll need a familiar, friendly face to ease the transition." Uwe's response was as much that had occurred today pre-planned. Helma carefully studied each member of the committee, making mental note of those who immediately nodded in agreement and who hesitated. She made especially careful note of those whose jaws she saw quietly clench, lips pursed slightly. But in the end, none raised an objection, just as she'd planned. Years of careful maneuvering spreading her influence amongst the Reich's citizens without ever truly eclipsing that of the Chancellor himself, and thus putting a target on her back. She'd even volunteered to take on messaging for the ongoing crisis of terrorism in the occupied territories of the Middle East and Chinese border regions at a time when national outrage had ended the career of every politician before her who tried. Her careful messaging and ability to manipulate information to place the blame firmly on the Americans had only increased her popularity and prepared them for the confrontation she knew was inevitable if the Reich was to survive. Though none objected, Helma remembered those who had remained uncomfortably silent. Once the ball was rolling, in all the chaos, it would be easy for their careers or lives to meet a similar end to the Chancellor's. Camp David, Maryland. Despite it being winter, the heated pool was kept a comfortable 86 degrees all times. When the President of the United States lifted himself out of it and into the bitter cold air, his body steamed furiously. He was quickly offered multiple towels and a thick, warm robe by several aides, whom he shooed away with great annoyance. He didn't even bother drying, but simply wrapped the robe around himself as he began the short trek to the main lodge. William Michaels, his national security advisor, fell lockstep in with him along with several other aides, who were all having hushed but fervent phone conversations on their cell phones. "What I want to know is how the hell we were blindsided like this? We've had the Reich penetrated for decades, and you're telling me nobody got wind of this?" Michaels shook his head as he kept to the pace with the president, who was still steaming in the bitterly cold Maryland winter air, a fitting visual given the president's unusually angry state. The conspirators must have been keeping this a tight secret from their own intelligence services, including the party security apparatus. There would have been few opportunities to sniff this one out. The president halted in angry surprise. "You're telling me that even the party had no clue this was coming?" Michaels shook his head once more. "Every source we've got has been telling us the same thing. They were blindsided. Everyone was blindsided. They kept this under real close wraps. Seems only a few senior members of the military in key commands throughout the Reich were in on it too. The plot had very well-placed support." The president began marching again. Michaels and the aides struggled to keep up. The main lodge of Camp David was swarming like a beehive that had just had a stone thrown into it, and the Secret Service team responsible for interior security replaced the team responsible for exterior security. Only a few hand-picked guards continued along. Those the president liked best and now shadowed him wherever he went. There were no other guests at Camp David on this retreat. The president had been hoping for a quiet weekend getaway, a quick trip to recharge. Nevertheless, the army of aides, bureaucrats, and liaisons that followed the president wherever he went had filled the place, and while they normally mostly kept to their rooms, the stunning news coming out of Germany had created a frenzy of activity. Military liaisons were coordinating with the Joint Chiefs and various other military and intelligence officials, while federal bureaucrats were overseeing responses by dozens of various agencies that made up the United States government. There would be no specific direction yet, not until the president gave it, but the United States was determined not to get caught flat-footed. General Thomas Breckinridge fell into the president's retinue as they marched to his personal quarters, so he could change into something more appropriate. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had come at the president's invitation, an opportunity to relax. The president swore that just a half hour ago the man had been in shorts and a t-shirt and headed for the squash court, and in what must have been no more than a few minutes, the barrel-chested man who oversaw the entirety of the United States military had changed into an impeccably pressed uniform, as if he'd been wearing it all day. "Thomas, you better not be bringing me any bad news." The president looked like he meant it, moving fast enough down the main hall of the resort that he was bordering on a jog. "We've got reports of increased military activity along the Palestinian border, but birds haven't seen any major buildup of forces in days prior, so I'm very confident they're simply posturing to match what our own increased security response is bound to be. The Geber line seems to be a flurry of activity, but the Germans have always known that this was their weakest front. They're likely simply trying to counter any attempt by us to capitalize on the chaos." The Geber line marked the boundary between Free Algeria, a U.S. ally, and the Nazi-occupied Northern Sahara territories in the wake of World War II. It had been the site of ferocious fighting during the brief two-week war, with the flat desert landscape heavily favoring German tanks. They had outperformed America's fleet of M60s so thoroughly that its replacement, the Abrams, had been rushed into production in a cycle of ongoing innovation. It had been incredibly pricey to rush a prototype tank into production and engineer fixes or upgrades later on, but many agreed the modern Abrams could outshoot and outfight anything the Nazis could bring to the table. The two-week ground war defeats, however, had pushed the Geber line several miles west, earning the Germans a slightly larger slice of Algeria and prompting a mass exodus by the local population from cities and villages that were suddenly on the wrong side of the border. Given the indefensibility of the terrain, it had made sense that the Germans were scrambling to move into a protective posture. Both sides had massive military forces in the area, which could begin combat operations within half a day at most of receiving orders. That's the first bit of good news I've heard in the last 10 minutes. I want you to keep us at DEFCON 3, but move local forces to heightened readiness. Nothing that'll spook the Germans. And get Berlin on the hotline, let them know we're simply matching. We won't start shooting unless they do. The general confirmed the president's order and removed himself from the group right as they got to the president's private room. Here, the rest of the gaggle dispersed to the adjoining halls but remained close. The president opened the door, and before slamming it shut behind him to change into more appropriate attire and handle the crisis that had interrupted his weekend, he turned once more to Michaels. And for God's sake, let's try to find out what the hell is going on in Germany and what they might do next. A $300 billion intelligence budget, and our best source is fucking German state news. The door slammed shut with great force, just inches from Michael's face. Northern Chinese-occupied Russian border. The drone wasn't nearly as stealthy as its American counterpart, but it was low observable and small enough to remain undetected by the Chinese air defense radars. The remoteness of the border region only made the probability of discovery even lower, and the ruggedness of the terrain made the threat of invasion improbable enough to warrant only a few border posts on the Chinese side. Likewise, the Germans manned only a token number of outposts, though unlike the Chinese, their problems were more about a lack of available manpower. The occupied Russian Far East, like most of the territory past the Urals, had never truly been integrated into the Reich, making it a bit of a frozen Wild West. There were outposts of civilization here, though, massive mining and refining colonies built by the Germans. These were lucrative targets to the stream of insurgents and terrorists that regularly poured over the Chinese border to strike at them. The Reich had complained for decades to the Chinese government, but the truth is the vast size of the border itself and the ruggedness of the terrain made it near impossible for the Chinese to actually police it. And not that they particularly wanted to. The Chinese Democratic People's Party was a close ally of the United States, and like most liberal governments of the world, disgusted by the Reich's long history of abuses and atrocities. It was why the US and Chinese intelligence apparatus regularly worked to train, supply, and support the various groups seeking to cross the border and attack German interests. The drone focused its camera on the small group of trucks approximately 1,500 feet below it. The thermal camera cut through the cover of night, which made the extreme high-definition camera useless at the moment. But the idling engines of the trucks and the men's own body heat below them were all the drone needed to home in on them. Several thousand miles away, the data stream for the drone was being monitored by German operators and decision-makers. After observing the men below unloading boxes of what closely matched containers of American Javelin anti-tank missiles, the order was given. The group of men worked without care. They all knew the real danger was when they crossed the border. They allowed the engines on the vehicles to idle, none of the men cherishing the thought of climbing back into a freezing vehicle once the work was done. Staff Sergeant Patrick Johnson of the 75th Ranger Regiment was technically only here to show the new Delta Force guys the ropes. Compared to other operations, this was a pure milk run, a meet and greet between the two new Deltas and Odovacheks, the slang term for the ethnic Russian and Mongolian fighters who regularly undertook cross-border raids into German-held territory. Johnson couldn't help but admire the Russians. They'd been fighting to liberate their nation for the better part of a century at this point. The Mongolians likewise had a bone to pick with the Germans, and the Reich had seized part of its oil-rich northernmost territories in a border dispute in the late 90s. In hindsight, Johnson knew he'd fucked up. He'd gotten complacent, mostly because Germany had never dared retaliate across the Chinese border. But meeting out in the open, keeping engines idling, and taking no measures to control their thermal signatures were all wildly against protocol. The first Faust Mark II air-to-surface missile exploded dead center in the formation of the vehicles, riding the drone's target designation laser with pinpoint accuracy. The others struck a few meters away. Luckily for Johnson, a truck had been in between him and both blasts, though he'd still have to hump it 2 days back to civilization with multiple fractured ribs and a serious concussion, most of that distance crawling on his hands and knees. The Deltas were caught in the blast and wiped out, along with most of the fighters. Johnson would attempt to triage the few survivors despite his own wounds, but realized that there was no way of saving any of them without guaranteeing his own death in return. The Army would give him a medal for his heroic fight for survival, but the loss of multiple fingers to frostbite would ensure an early retirement. Johnson never hung that medal up. He tossed it the moment he was clear of the ceremony. He had known better and gotten a lot of people killed because he got complacent. Hong Kong, China. Sun Ning didn't need to take these meetings anymore. She had people for that now. She was the president's most trusted foreign advisor, with eyes on a future run for office herself. But diplomacy was about relationships, and some relationships could shape the fate of nations. The restaurant hadn't changed much in the years that she'd been coming, except that the hidden microphones and cameras had gotten much more sophisticated and were now Chinese-made, a symbol of China's ascension to the world stage and increasing technological independence from the United States. The more that China changed, though, the more Ning appreciated the deep love for tradition of the Chinese people. The technology advanced, but ways of life and restaurants remained largely the same. Fitting for the world's oldest civilization, it was comforting. She'd expected the senior diplomat to arrive late. She had once years ago. In the diplomatic world, there were no accidents, only strategically calculated moves. But Ning was surprised to see the German woman arrive on time, a mere minute after Ning's own arrival at their usual table. Selma Krause exchanged the usual pleasantries, as was customary. To outside observers, they were two old friends meeting for a meal. But there was no love lost between the two women, whose words shaped the path of their two nations in Asia and beyond. The waiter, a Chinese intelligence agent, lightly touched the back of the German diplomat's chair as he left after taking their order. She appeared not to notice, and Ning was pleased. That brief touch had deposited a miniature listening device developed by the Americans, which was no larger than a large flea, and would cling to the diplomat's clothing the moment she leaned back in her chair. The small corner of the restaurant afforded them privacy from the general dining area, and once she was satisfied the waitstaff were out of earshot, Krause broke the silence. "I seem to recall warning you that relying on the Americans would be a mistake." Ning didn't blink at the veiled threat. "Violating Chinese sovereignty and murdering 15 people was a mistake, Miss Krause. You killed 2 Americans and can offer no proof of weapon smuggling. I think you'll find that it was you who made the mistake." The diplomat seemed unfazed by the retaliatory threat. "We warned you repeatedly about the border attacks. We warned you about tightening security after the radiological attacks 7 years ago. We've been nothing but patient with China, Miss Singh. I think you have underestimated the consequences of that patience running out." Singh tilted her head despite herself. This was the most overt threat any representative of the Reich had ever delivered. "I hope your new chancellor has the sense to remember the promise of Sito's Article 5. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was the world's most successful military and political alliance, spanning North America and much of Western Asia, uniting most of the world's most powerful political, economic, and military powers. The entire organization, however, was carefully balanced around a single point of failure, Article 5. An attack on one was an attack on all. If that promise failed, the faith that bound together the Allied powers, who more often than not had diverging interests, might falter. A single stumble could cause diplomatic waves around the world, dramatically changing the balance of power as Sito and its members' promises to other nations were cast into doubt. Krause calmly sipped from her ice water but never responded. Instead, she gathered her things and wished Singh a pleasant evening. Gulf of Oman. The pair of F-18s swung low, buzzing the German destroyers with barely 100 feet of clearance. The roar of the afterburning engines were a clear warning, but the ships were undeterred. The American pilots themselves knew that they were being targeted by the surface group's air defense radars, and more beyond from shore-based air defense batteries manned by Iranians. All it would take is one itchy trigger finger to hurl the world into a true catastrophe. The destroyers deployed boarding parties on fast attack boats. Under cover of the big ships, the Kriegsmarine Special Boarding Action sailors climbed onto the Chinese-flagged container and cargo ships that the German Surface Action Group had ordered to halt under threat of attack. The ship's captains would be temporarily arrested and control over the ship handed over to the Kriegsmarine, who would sail them back to German-held ports along the Iranian coast. The order for a complete energy blockade of China had been given just that morning, and now all across the Persian and Oman Gulfs, German Navy vessels moved to impound Chinese-flagged ships. Merchant vessels in other countries such as Bermuda were allowed to continue as normal, but in the future, they would be denied entry into the Persian Gulf by a sizable German fleet for as long as they were contracted to carry oil and gas destined for China. The crews of the Chinese vessels would be released as soon as their ships were safely in Iranian ports, where the Iranians would provide transportation back home. The ships themselves would be either held under impound or simply reflagged and repurposed by the Reich. Two American carrier strike groups loitered 100 nautical miles from the mouth of the Persian Gulf, their crews fully prepared for action against the boarding German ships. However, no such order came. Fearing a rapid escalation, the American president instead opted to attempt diplomacy first. The real crisis would come a day later. Egypt had been allowed a token of independence despite being surrounded on both sides by German-occupied territories. At 0300 hours the next morning, that independence came to an end with a massive air assault of Cairo, followed hours later by a huge column of German combat vehicles streaming out of Palestine. With the capital under control, Germany closed the Suez Canal to all Chinese shipping. This, combined with an energy embargo of German energy products and the seizing of Chinese vessels operating in the Persian Gulf, caused an economic disaster in China. The nation relied on imports from the region for half of its energy needs. And even with America rapidly expanding production over the next several months, it would take years for U.S. oil exports to fulfill China's needs. The Chinese economy came to a crashing halt, then a deep recession and eventual contraction. The new German chancellor reinforced the Russian Far East with multiple Wehrmacht divisions and an expansion in air and missile bases. The American president would opt for diplomacy over confrontation, though in the years to come, many would question the attempt to find a diplomatic solution with the German Reich. Wichita, Kansas. You'll have approximately 13 minutes to find shelter. There hadn't been anywhere large enough to accommodate the crowd of farmers and ranchers with such short notice, so the city had been forced to commandeer a local theater. Now the place was packed tight with over 200 farm workers and a small retinue of military and government officials. The latter were mostly congregated on the front row of seats, where one by one each official had taken to the stage to deliver their portion of the evening's brief to the Kansas natives. The current and last speaker was from the Civil Defense Corps, a government agency most people had forgotten about after the scare of the two-week war in the 1980s. Recently, though, the agency tasked with hardening America against nuclear attack and ensuring her survival in the aftermath of one had resumed its duties with vigor. You're all considered essential workers for the nation. Thus, know that you're a priority for aid in the wake of an attack. The speaker, an Air Force major, was not being well received by the increasingly irritated crowd. One rancher near the front stood up. "Now, how the hell is we supposed to find shelter and handle all the other business you've been giving us all night on top of that?" The major looked uneasy at the question. "Well, your personal safety is priority, naturally. Other tasks like covering drinking water sources, feed, and the animals themselves can come after, though you'll have very limited time to act and protect them from the effects of fallout." "How much time?" The crowd murmured as the rancher voiced their frustration. "Approximately 30 minutes, depending on the location of the blast and atmospheric conditions, but you should move as quickly as possible. The greatest threat will be the contamination of drinking water and feed, as well as the animals themselves, naturally." "You already done said that, Mr. Air Force Major. What we want to know is how in Sam hell you expect us to do any of this before it's raining fallout. Most of us got open-air irrigation and drinking sources. How the hell's we supposed to cover up a 100-square-foot pond, let alone in 30 minutes? Another rancher stood up to voice his own irritation. "My animals range free. How you suppose I'm supposed to round them up and cover them up?" A farmer now stood. "You have any idea how many square miles of crops each farm around these parts manage? How the hell are we going to cover all that up?" The major ignored the first two speakers and focused on the farmer. Yes, actually the crops will likely be a total loss anyways due to follow-on effects. But what's important is to remove the top 6 inches of topsoil after an attack before planting new crops. You want to store that soil somewhere away from animals or drinking water." The crowd jeered. The farmer the major had been addressing shook his head incredulously. "Boy, you got any idea how much work it'll be to strip away 6 inches of soil across miles and miles of property? And what the hell is we supposed to do with all that radioactive soil? Make a mountain out of it? No, sir, you definitely do not want to store it in a way that the wind could catch and spread it around. It would be best to bury it." The proposition was flat out ridiculous. The crowd had had enough. They began to jeer the Air Force major. Some shouted as the anger grew and grew into a crescendo. The city major took to the stage to attempt to calm things down, but had no luck. The Air Force and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers delegation decided it'd be best to end the briefing early and exit via the rear of the theater. They couldn't blame the farmers and ranchers, though it was impossible work. But what else was the government supposed to tell the people? That their only realistic choice was to die in the blasts or starve afterward? Someone had to try to rebuild after the bombs fell. Berlin. Helma Schneider, Chancellor of the Reich, was troubled. It was a rare moment of weakness to which she only afforded one man the privilege of seeing. Uwe Schmidt, her one-time conspirator to overthrow the chancellery and now most trusted advisor. The two didn't love each other, they were simply the only other individual that each trusted and appreciated as an equal in the entirety of the Reich. Their intimacy was nothing more than an extension of their partnership. Uwe, prompted by Helma's sigh, looked up from the breakfast table at her, still lounging in bed going over daily briefing reports on her electronic pad. "If you're having reservations, I should remind you of the timetable." The timetable, an innocuous enough document drafted up while the two were still conspiring to take the chancellery for themselves. A breakdown of all the woes of the Third Reich, and a ticking clock to address the various cancers eating the Reich from within before American conventional and political power hopelessly eclipsed them. She hadn't been able to truly end the Reich's disastrous cultural advancement programs, the guise through which generations of German leaders had systematically wiped out other races in occupied territories, sometimes through outright murder, as was the case for the Jews, others through simply working them to death in slave camps, as was the case for the Russians, others still through careful social engineering and, of course, forced sterilization. It's not that she didn't believe in the superiority of the German race, that much was obvious. The United States had to enlist the aid of all the mongrel nations in the world to rival a dwindling Germany. It was exactly the fact that the United States was able to call upon the other nations of the world until their numbers could be thinned out sufficiently. This gave America a massive pool of talent to draw from to raise new generations of engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. And even the inferior races got lucky, and the results were unfortunate. American military capabilities had been significantly propelled ahead of the Reich's. "We're risking open war with the Americans. Are you sure that we're prepared for this?" Uwe was silent, carefully picking at his breakfast. Finally he answered, "I am certain that the longer we don't act, the greater the gulf between our two nations. I'm certain that failure to act today ensures the Reich's defeat tomorrow." Tokyo, Japan. The protests had lasted a week and begun just 3 days after gas prices in Japan had quadrupled overnight. The German ban on all oil exports to China several years ago had now officially been extended to Japan, with disastrous results for the Japanese economy. Some had been better prepared than others, with the nation reading the writing on the wall and attempting to switch to electric vehicles. But while now 22% of the Japanese auto fleet was all electric, the vast industrial apparatus of Japan was almost entirely powered by petroleum and natural gas. The United States had promised to increase exports, but feeding China's voracious appetite had consumed nearly all of its export capability. Complicating matters back home, the environmental movement, helped along by tens of millions in funds by German intelligence, had grown exponentially in the wake of dramatically increased energy exploitation across North America, prompting furious protests and interrupting further expansion of an already bloated energy industry. The American ambassador to Japan could hear the thousands of angry protesters on the streets, even from deep within the embassy itself. The Marine security detail had been tripled as a precautionary measure, but there had never been any violence toward the U.S. embassy from the Japanese people, and it wasn't expected now. But the Japanese people were angry, already struggling with a weak economy made worse by an aging population. The gas crisis had created a true disaster for the nation, and firebrands, no doubt helped along by German influence agents, had put the blame squarely on the United States of America. The new German chancellor had played her cards well, explaining that the, quote, temporary blockade was due to American destabilization efforts around the world, funding terrorist and extremist movements that attacked German interests. How exactly Japan fit into that narrative she never bothered to explain, and she didn't need to. Nearly overnight, Japanese support for membership in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization had collapsed. If only they pulled out of the alliance and demoted their relationship with the United States, the Reich would have no reason to continue the embargo. The ambassador prepared for a very difficult meeting with his Japanese counterparts. No doubt the Germans had shaped that part of the narrative well, and to their credit, it was working. The entire move was quite clever. Germany had no chance of breaking the SEATO alliance militarily, but unless the US took drastic actions, it might just break it politically. Oval Office, White House, United States of America. "Bob, it has to be the Germans who fire first. We all understand this, yes?" Bob Grumlin, National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, nodded. The President stood with his back to his cabinet, sitting on the edge of the Resolute desk and looking out the large bay windows onto the Rose Garden beyond. Bob noted that the President sounded confident, sure, which was a good sign. "The SAG commander has been thoroughly briefed. and the point was significantly stressed to her. Nobody is to fire until the Germans do. The president turned to face his cabinet seated on the chairs and the twin couches that were the centerpiece of the Oval Office, couches from which history had been made repeatedly for the nearly 100 years since America's rise from a regional to a global superpower. It had been on that couch that President Roosevelt had met with the British and French diplomats when he informed them that the United States would not continue the war in the European theater past securing North Africa. During his time in office, the president had, as many before him, wondered if Roosevelt had made a mistake, if history could have been different, if the United States had fought to liberate Europe. "You're confident we can bait him into shooting first?" Bob nodded firmly. "Our MALDs will decoy as an entire F-18 strike force. Germans will assume that we mean to shoot the moment they deny passage to the Japanese tanker. With that many Hornets bearing down on them, at least in their mind, they won't be able to afford not to. With their signature management capabilities, the MALDs won't look like much to any civilian radars in the region. Only the Germans and anyone downrange from them will see them as Hornets. Afterward, we'll be able to claim they shot down a pair of fighters on a peacekeeping patrol. If we lose any actual birds, we can just point at their wreckage later." The president turned to the head of his CIA. "And we can control the narrative?" The man simply nodded. He didn't need to say more. In fact, the man hardly ever spoke, a quality that deeply unnerved Bob, probably because when he did choose to speak, it was usually a prelude to a new crisis. "Then get the Japanese on the line. Tell them soon as the SAG commander lets us know she's ready, it's a go. And thank them for their cooperation." Bob nodded, already rising from his seat. There wasn't a moment to lose. Kathy's Sandwich Pit, Washington, D.C. Hours later. The sandwich shop wasn't much more than a counter with a few small toaster ovens and a refrigerator for cold drinks. One of the many of its like that nestled inside federal buildings to offer their occupants a quick bite to eat. Thus, it was no surprise, and no pleasure, that Bob spotted the CIA director walk in and place his order. The man received his order a prompt 2 minutes later, and though the two hadn't made eye contact yet, he immediately turned and walked straight to Bob's table, sitting without asking for permission. The director spoke in a low enough tone that only they would be able to hear over the low din of the small shop. "I need your help with something, Bob." This was not what he expected. As a national security advisor, Bob had intimate relationships with the various heads of the United States' vast intelligence apparatus, but there had always been a gulf between him and the CIA man. Not one of personal differences, but prompted by the man's deep detachment from the entire Washington political apparatus, a quality that, along with his cold, calculating intellect, made him an excellent CIA director. He didn't wait to continue speaking. "We need to stress to the president the risk of an overwhelming conventional victory against the Germans." "You think we outmatched them that bad?" Bob spoke between bites. The toasted sandwich was the first thing he'd eaten since breakfast. "I know we do. In many, though not all arenas. Most importantly, in all the critical ones. A substantial enough advantage that the Germans might find themselves with only one option left." Bob stopped chewing. There was a risk everyone knew, but hearing the director speak it aloud was making it real. It was no longer theoretical, especially with 100,000 tons of American firepower currently steaming for an artificial confrontation with a German blockading force in the Persian Gulf. You need to convince the president to activate the Tucamo fleet immediately. The Germans are sure to find out and see it as a provocation. Unless they're willing to sit on their hands after losing an entire surface action group in the Persian, I think the provocation's worth the security investment. The director stood and left, apparently having decided the conversation was at an end. And he wasn't wrong about the conversation being at an end and about the need to get the Tucamo fleet airborne immediately. Bob scrambled to pick up his trash and grab his briefcase. He still had several hours before the Roosevelt launched its air wing, but he couldn't shake the sense that he needed to act with urgency. Gulf of Oman, hours later. With Iraq and Kuwait under the dominion of the Reich, and Iran its close partner, that left only Saudi ports for Japanese tankers to dock at. But the Reich's taking of Egypt and controlling the Suez Canal had also allowed them to extend their influence into the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf was littered with shore-based anti-ship systems through which the Reich could threaten any ship attempting to dock at Saudi Arabia's eastern ports. And there was the matter of the blockading fleet at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, a moderately sized surface group, with U.S. attack subs confirming the presence of at least 3 German submarines in the vicinity. 2 of them were already being tracked by their Virginia-class tails. The Roosevelt had dispatched its anti-submarine helicopters half an hour earlier to begin the hunt for the 3rd. The Japanese tanker, whose crew was taking a substantial risk and had agreed to the job anyway, slowly steamed toward the entrance to the Gulf. Predictably, part of the German SAG broke off to intercept, warning the ship off through radio hails. The MALDS, launched via the Roosevelt's F-18s from out of range of the German radars, came into view of those same radars shortly after. The advanced decoys could replicate the radar return of any American craft, and more than a few non-American ones too. To German air defense operators, the skies suddenly filled with American F-18 Super Hornets. There was little time to act. The airborne radar aircraft was the first to detect them, still 100 kilometers or so out of range of American anti-ship harpoons. The sheer number of contacts indicated to the German Fregattenkapitän that a warning would be of little use, though he still ordered one be broadcast anyways. It was clear from their sheer numbers that the Americans were here for a fight. The German combat air patrols vectored in on the MALDS, and their SAGS carrier immediately moved to combat air operations, launching its alert aircraft and mustering its reserves. Satellite reconnaissance had tracked the Roosevelt and her escorts for days. There was no hiding from the birds in the sky in modern war, so the Germans expected a significant fight and were ready for it. What they were less prepared for were the capabilities of the American MALDS. German air defense missiles beat the fighters to the punch, but the MALDS were launching their own attack. Acting as electronic warfare platforms, the decoys began to flood German sensors with electronic noise, significantly degrading their performance. Data links allowed them to target missiles fired by F-18s, still well out of sight of the German radars, to their targets. The AIM-260's extreme range allowed the real Hornets to fire at the edge of German coverage, which had been significantly reduced thanks to the MALDS's electronic attack. But German operators were working to cut through the noise, and as the MALDS's were blown out of the sky, their interference decreased with every loss. Soon, the vulnerable F-18s would be targetable if they pressed the attack, but they didn't. Instead, they loitered just out of the effective range of German weapons. The F-35s were not invisible to radar, but very low observable. They were even more difficult to spot when flying head-on, and thus presenting their stealthiest geometry to German radars. Even when spotted by German airborne radars, it was impossible to give their fighters a weapons-quality lock until the F-35s were within a few dozen kilometers. But by then, they were already guiding standoff missiles fired by loitering F-18s to their targets before launching their own. German fighters, much of which expended most of their missiles firing at decoys, either had to RTB or throw themselves at the F-35s at full afterburner. Their only hope was to get within close range, where the F-35's dogfighting ability was significantly limited versus the agile German interceptors. But the Americans had the advantage of numbers, and the F-18s could engage German aircraft without being engaged themselves, thanks to the F-35's data link capabilities. The LRASMs became detectable to German air defense radars when they were about 22 kilometers out. Made of stealthy materials, the missiles were slow compared to German supersonic and even hypersonic anti-ship missiles, with a jet engine that kept them at just below the speed of sound and about 50 feet above the waves. Their strength was their ability to avoid detection until it was almost too late, though their slow speed did afford the Germans about 20 seconds to engage. The German anti-ship barrage mostly consisted of supersonic sea-skimming missiles, with a sprinkling of new-generation hypersonic weapons. The hypersonic missiles were challenging targets and exploded with the energy of a small bus full of TNT, but luckily were launched in too few volleys to overwhelm American defenses. Nonetheless, the Roosevelt took a missile to her stern, causing significant damage to the flight deck and the hangar below, but nothing that would knock her out of action for long, nor prevent her from recovering her aircraft. A fleet-on-fleet engagement that would have lasted for hours, maybe even a day in any previous conflict, was over within just a single hour. One may get away with fielding a less than modern tank or infantry fighting vehicle and still expect success, but nowhere did America's technological advantage matter more than in air and naval combat, where the tactical advantage of even just one generation of weapon system over the other proved overwhelmingly decisive. In the years to come, survivors would piece together their own past and come to the conclusion that the German Reich was ultimately left with no conventional options. Its genocidal agenda led to its own imminent demographic collapse, while the American superpower exploited the talent of the same global peoples that the Reich considered inferior. With a coalition of nations against it, rebellion within, and a collapsing population, the Reich would turn to increasingly desperate measures to fend off its certain defeat. Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich would last less than a century. It would take far longer than that for the survivors to rebound from the edge of extinction. Now go watch how this all started with What If Hitler Won World War II 1950s, or click this other video instead.